Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another chilling episode. If you have your own terrifying experience to share, please mail us to be featured in our next episode. So before we dive in, please subscribe to our small channel and leave a comment, letting me know which country you are listening from. So without further ado, let's begin the story. I never meant to be a gravedigger. Honestly, I didn't even want to come back to Maple Hollow. But when Uncle Ray broke his hip and my job at the two-land dye plant in Richmond dried up, there wasn't much else to do. I figured working nights in a quiet cemetery, especially one tucked away in a half-forgotten mountain town, couldn't be all that bad. Less noise, less drama, and enough distance between me and the crap I left behind in the city. Looking back, though, I should have asked more questions when they handed me the lantern. It was old, really old. Black and brass with a heavy glass dome and thick leather handle that smelled like storm water and mildew. The kind of thing that felt like it'd weight beyond just metal. Sheriff Greeley gave it to me the first night, right after handing me the ring of rusted keys. He held it out with both hands, like it was something sacred. "You light this at sundown," he said. "Don't let it go out. Keep it with you till dawn." Simple as that. I laughed, thinking he was half joking. "What? No flashlight?" "What?" "Didn't smile, it was Elias's," he said. "Gravedigger before you. Kept it burning every night. Town's always done it this way." I should have known better than to scoff Elias Bishop. The man was more ghost than person, even before he vanished. Lived in a shack behind the cemetery, barely spoke to anyone except maybe the pastor and the guy who did his grocery runs. Nobody really knew him, but they all respected him. Some even feared him. When I was a kid, folks said he talked to the dead, that he could hear bones shift beneath the earth. Back then, it just sounded like spooky stories kids told on sleepovers. But now, I was taking over his job, holding his weird old lantern, and walking into a field full of people no one had spoken to in decades. The cemetery itself wasn't all that large, just a wide slope at the edge of the woods, backed by maple trees that dropped red leaves like blood in the fall. The oldest stones leaned at odd angles, names worn down to whispers. The newer. The section was closer to the dirt road, with polished markers and plastic flowers. They didn't give me much to go on, just a rough map of the plots, shift log, and the old caretaker's cabin to crash in. The place smelled like dust and pine cleaner. But at least it had running water and a mattress that didn't cave in the middle. I'll skip the boring stuff about settling in. My first night was uneventful. Too quiet, in fact. Just me, the lantern, and the creak of branches in the dark. I did my rounds, checking the gates, tapping each grave marker like Elias supposedly did. No idea why, just figured it was tradition. The lantern burned steady, even when a cold wind blew down from the ridge. That first night, it gave me a strange kind of comfort. The flame flickered softly inside the glass, glowing a deep amber, almost golden. It didn't feel like just light. It felt like something watching with me. That was 2 weeks ago. The problem started on the 12th night. Little things at first. The gate on the northern fence would be open, even though I locked it. My thermos would be empty when I swore I hadn't touched it. Tools in the shed moved places. My boots went missing one night, just gone when I woke up. I found them sitting upright at the foot of a grave I hadn't even checked the night before. I started writing things down in a notebook just to be sure I wasn't losing it. Elias had kept one too, though his was nowhere to be found when I moved in. I asked Sheriff Greeley about it. Shrugged. Maybe he took it with him, he said, but something in his tone said otherwise, like he knew damn well where it went. But wasn't about to say. Then came the storm. That night, the sky cracked open like it was trying to split the world in half. Lightning danced across the ridge, and thunder shook the glass in the cabin windows. I lit the lantern just before sunset, like always. The flames sputtered but caught, glowing as usual. I did my first pass through the rows, pausing at the Bishop family plot Eliza's people. His own stone wasn't there yet, which felt wrong somehow. I kept thinking about where he went. No one ever found him. He just vanished, leaving the lantern burning on the porch. The storm hit harder around 1 a.m. Trees thrashed. Rain fell sideways, and mud pooled at the base of the hills. I ducked into the tool shed just to catch my breath. That's when I heard It's something like scraping, not wood on wood or metal on metal. It sounded ... bone on stone. I stepped back out and froze. The lantern, still burning, was sitting on top of a headstone. One I hadn't even passed yet. I hadn't put it down. When it hit me, someone else had, or something. I should have left then. I should have walked straight down to the sheriff's house, thrown the damn lantern in his face, and hopped the first Greyhound out of Maple Hollow. But I did instead. I walked toward it, wind soaking my back, wind howling like wolves around. My ears, I reached out for the lantern, my hand shaking, and as soon as I touched it, the flame died. No flicker, no smoke. Just gone. Darkness slammed down like a hammer. The cold that followed wasn't just from the rain. It felt like the ground itself had exhaled, and something beneath it had woken up. Something angry. I stood there in the downpour, drenched from head to toe, staring at the lantern as it sat dead atop the headstone. The only sound was the storm tearing through the maples, making the trees lean like they were trying to crawl away. It was strange. Could still see the lantern clearly in the dark, not because of any light, but because of how it seemed to pull my eyes, like it didn't want me to look away. Everything around it felt darker, heavier, like it was the center of something I hadn't noticed before. And even though it had gone out, I could swear I heard it humming. Not audibly, more like the way your ears ring after a loud sound, but focused, like it was coming from something. I reached for it again, but the moment my fingers brushed the cold brass, the hairs on my arms shot straight up. My instincts screamed to leave it there. But instincts don't matter when you're soaked, scared, and standing in the middle of a cemetery at 2 a.m. I grabbed the lantern and backed away slowly, eyes scanning every direction. I didn't see anything moving. Not at first. Looking back, though, I think that was the point. I wasn't meant to see it. Not yet. The lantern stayed dead all the way back to the shed, and I didn't have matches with me. That's when I realized I'd left the match tin back at the cabin, which made no sense, because I always kept it in my left coat pocket. Always. I'd lit the lantern with it less than an hour before. I patted myself down 3 times. Nothing. When I got back to the cabin, the match tin was sitting on the table, open and empty. Not a single matchstick left. The thing is, I'd filled it 2 days ago at the general store. 20 wooden matches. I'd only used 4 since then, I told myself. I must have lost them, or maybe they got wet, but deep down, I knew that was a lie. The tin was dry, the box was clean, and the faint smell of sulfur hung in the air like someone had just struck the last one seconds before I walked in. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the narrow bed in the cabin, lantern on the table beside me, still dark as pitch. I kept waiting for the storm to let up, but it didn't. Around 3:30 a.m., I heard what I first thought was wind in the trees again, except it wasn't. It was breathing. Not heavy or obvious. It was soft, like someone trying to be quiet just outside the window. I held my breath to listen. The breathing kept going. I grabbed the lantern and sat upright, listening harder. Still no light, still no matches. So I sat there in the dark, watching the window, heart pounding in my throat. The breathing stopped after a while. I'm not sure when exactly. It's just ... faded. But I didn't feel any better. I'll skip the boring stuff about how I spent the next day hunting for more matches and replacing the ones that had gone missing. The store was closed due to storm damage, so I had to ask Pastor Mullins for a box. He looked me over with this strange kind of pity, like he already knew I wasn't sleeping. Like he'd seen this story unfold before. Said something weird. 2, he told me, Elias used to carry 2 lanterns, but the second one had gone missing a long time ago. That made me pause. Asked if he knew where it had ended up. He just shook his head. If you find it, he said, don't try to light it. The next few nights I doubled up on everything. 2 sets of matches, a backup flashlight, even a walkie-talkie I used to test range with the sheriff's office. Nothing happened for 3 straight nights. It lulled me into thinking maybe the storm had just spooked me and I was imagining things. That is, until I found the notebook. Not mine. Ilias's. It wasn't in the cabin. It wasn't in the shed. I found it sitting upright, neatly placed on a grave marker near the north fence. Same spot where I'd found my boots earlier that week. The cover was water damaged, but still readable. Inside, the entries were short, clipped, methodical. Every night was logged with the same kind of military precision. Lantern lit. 6:47 p.m. wind shift noted. Southeast. Movement in section C, Forno source found. The further I read, the worse it got. Starting about 6 months ago, Ilias's notes changed tone. They stopped being just observations, started referring to something he called the stirring. And every time the lantern failed door even flickered, he logged it as a warning. Flicker at 2:11 a.m. ground responded. Lantern. Died Graves cold to the touch. Then finally, the last entry, dated 3 days before he vanished. Lantern failed completely. Can't feel the wards. Something is watching me. Will try to hold until next cycle. If I don't return, don't stop lighting it. That's when it hit. Methys wasn't just a job, it was a damn ritual, and I'd already broken it. After finding Elias's notebook, I couldn't look at the cemetery the same way. Every stone felt like it was watching me. Every shadow held something just out of sight. I tried to convince myself I was just reading too much into it, letting my imagination go wild. But that's easier said than done when you're walking. Alone through rows of graves at night, carrying a lantern that might be the only thing holding something back. I started noticing details I hadn't before graves, with disturbed soil, even though no one had been buried that week. Flowers trampled. In strange patterns, symbols scratched into tree trunks around the perimeter of the fence. Elias had marked a few of those in his notes. But seeing them in person gave me a kind of quiet dread that settled under my skin and wouldn't leave. The next thing to go missing was my watch. Nothing special, just an old Timex with a cracked face that I wore every shift. I'd left it on the table next to the lantern before bed, like I always did. When I woke up, the table was completely bare. No watch, no lighter, no coffee mug. At first I thought maybe I'd left them outside, but after tearing the cabin apart, I found the watch. It was on the front steps of the chapel, under a dried maple leaf ticking backwards. I don't even know if that's something a regular watch can do, but there it was, still running, still ticking. Just counting in the wrong direction. That same day, I found one of Elias's coats hanging on the back of the shed door. I'd searched that shed top to bottom my first week there. There was nothing like that in there. But suddenly, this thick canvas coat, stitched at the cuffs, with a weird lump in one of the pockets, was hanging right there like someone had just left it. I pulled it down and checked inside. The lump turned out to be a small cloth-bound pouch filled with old coins tokens. Really, each had different years stamped into them. But they all had the same word etched on the back in the same crooked hand, offering. Looking back though, I should have just left them where they were. Something about the weight of those coins felt off to warm, almost sticky, like they'd been in a pocket that never cooled down. I tucked the pouch back into the coat and hung it up again, but it didn't stay there long. The next night, the coat was gone. It's not stolen. It's not blown away. Just ... gone. Like it had never been there to begin with. I tried talking to Sheriff Greeley again. I told him about the coins, the backwards watch, even the breathing outside the window. He leaned against his truck, chewing on a toothpick, and didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he muttered something that didn't sit right with me. Some jobs are about more than digging holes, son. Keep the light going, you stay quiet, and you don't ask questions you ain't ready to hear the answers to. Then he got in his truck and left. Didn't even say goodbye. That night, I brought the lantern out earlier than usual. I watched the sun dip below the tree line and felt the weight of the flames settle into the air like it was part of the landscape, not just a tool I carried. As I made my rounds, I stopped at the Bishop family plot again. The headstones hadn't moved, but the dirt around Elias's empty grave looked ... fresh, like it had been turned recently. I crouched down and ran my fingers through it, dry on top but damp and loose underneath. Someone or something had been there. I'll skip the boring stuff about walking the perimeter and double-checking all the locks. What matters is what happened around midnight. That's when I heard something strange. Not footsteps, not breathing. It was humming. sound drifting through the trees like it was carried on fog. I followed it, lantern in hand, toward the southern edge of the cemetery, where the woods grew denser. That's when I noticed something new as stone I'd never seen before. It wasn't marked, and it didn't match the others. It was darker, smoother, and cold to the touch, even with the lantern's heat brushing against it. I ran my hand across the face of it and felt something carved there, shallow and deep at once. It wasn't a name. It was a spiral, scratched, over and over as if someone had been tracing it for years. I turned to head back, only to see that the path behind me was gone. Now the rows of graves I'd walked through just minutes ago were different now, rearranged. Some were closer together, others gone completely. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking I must have gotten turned around, but the layout had changed. And right there in the middle of it all was the bishop plot again, though I could have sworn I was 100 yards away from it just moments before. The lantern flame flared too high, too fast, and then calmed. But something in the air shifted. I smelled earth. Not fresh dirt, but something older, like clay cracked by time and dried blood. I walked back toward the cabin in a daze, mind racing, heart pounding. I didn't stop shaking until dawn. Even then, I couldn't forget what I saw when I passed the chapel on my way back. On the wooden door, in clear finger marks etched into the dust, were the words K-E-E-P, digging. It didn't take long for my nerves to start unraveling. After that night, the one with the spiral stone and the rearranged grave's eyes started making mistakes. Small things at first. I'd forget which row I was in. I'd lose count of my paces. I'd light the lantern too early or too late, and the moment I stepped outside, it would flicker like it was disappointed. I began walking with the notebook in my jacket pocket at all times, flipping through Elias's old entries like they might give me answers. But all they did was pile on more questions. He had dozens of entries about shifts and requests and something called the turning hour, but no explanations. It's just numbers and strange symbols. And one repeated line that showed, up over and over again, always underlined, do not speak to the ones that rise. At first I thought it was metaphorical, some kind of poetic way of describing nightmares or hallucinations. But after the fifth night of hearing voices just outside the range of the lantern's light, I stopped assuming anything. These weren't whispers in the wind or my own thoughts echoing back at me. These were voices, real and close and dry as bone. My name. Others didn't use words at all, just sounds, long drawn-out moans, or high, airy laughter that made my skin crawl. I remember one in particular that spoke in perfect rhythm, like it was reciting a nursery rhyme, but backwards. I couldn't make sense of it, but I felt the words deep in my teeth, like a vibration. I tried sleeping during the day, but that didn't help either. I'd doze off for an hour, then wake up drenched in sweat, sometimes already standing at the edge of the cemetery without remembering how I got there. Once, I found myself inside the chapel, holding one of the offering coins in my hand with dirt caked under my nails. I hadn't meant to dig anything. My shovel was still in the shed, but my hands were raw, fingers red and bruised, and I had soil packed into my sleeves and the folds of my collar like I'd been crawling through it. I'll skip the boring details about how. I tried locking myself in the cabin, how I blocked the door with furniture, nailed the windows shut, even unplugged the mini-fridge because I thought it was humming in that same pattern the voice had used. None of it helped. The place wasn't haunted, it was watched. There's a difference. Haunted means something left behind. Watched means something still there. A few nights later, I noticed the lantern didn't burn right. Flame was still there, but it looked wrong. Less like fire, more like something alive pretending to be fire. It pulsed in strange rhythms, swaying even when there was no wind, and sometimes it grew so bright it hurt to look at. Then it would dim to a soft glow, barely more than a candle, and I'd feel this pull. Like the dark was leaning in around it, trying to smother it. I started carrying backup flashlights, but the batteries drained faster than they should have. One night I turned on a brand new mag light, and it popped, just burst like it had overheated. Even though the air was cold enough to see my breath, the worst moment came about a week after I found the notebook. I was doing my rounds, circling. The older graves near the southeast edge stones that hadn't been visited in decades. It was quiet, almost peaceful, and for a moment I convinced myself everything was fine. Then I tripped. I went down hard, skinned my palm, and when I looked back to see what caught my boot, I froze. It was a hand, not bone. It's not decayed. A hand grayish and cold, sticking out of the dirt like it had just broken through the surface. I scrambled backward, heart slamming, and watched as the fingers twitched once, then went still. I didn't go near it again that night. I marked the spot in my notebook, then returned just before dawn with a shovel. I dug carefully, expecting to find a body maybe. Someone had been buried shallow by mistake or something had eroded the soil. But when I got down to the depth of the hand, there was nothing. No wrist, no arm, no body, just soil. The hand was gone like it had never been there. No drag marks, no signs of a prank. Just loose dirt and silence. I stood in that pit for nearly 15 minutes trying to make sense of what I'd seen. My own footprints surrounded me. There were no others, no signs of digging. Just me, alone. And yet, couldn't shake the feeling that something had pulled back just before I reached at something that hadn't wanted to be uncovered later that day. I got a call from Pastor Mullins. He said someone had left a note. At the chapel, no signature. No handwriting he recognized. It just said, "Lantern failed. Graves waking. Watch the old stones." He asked if I knew what it meant. I lied. Said it was probably kids messing around. But I knew better. I'd seen the stones. I'd seen them shift, realign, vanish, and return. I'd watched names rearrange themselves in the corners of my vision, always going back to normal when I looked straight on. That night I didn't light the lantern right away. I wanted to see what would happen. Just for a minute, just to test it. The moment the sun dropped below the ridge, the air changed. Birds stopped calling. Crickets went silent. And in that stillness, I felt something. Move. Not walk. Not crawl. Move like mist slithering up from beneath the graves, coiling around my ankles, wrapping around my throat. I lit the lantern in a panic. The flame caught with a sound I'd never heard before. Something like a hiss. But not angry. More... disappointed. Like it knew I'd hesitated. Like it expected better. That was the first night I heard footsteps. Behind me when I walked the rows. Steady, measured, just a few paces behind. Always stopping when I stopped. Never speeding up, never getting closer. But always there. The night I found the trapdoor was the same night I stopped pretending this was just a weird job with creepy stories. Up to that point, I'd really tried to hold on to the idea that I could finish my shifts, keep my head down, and wait for something to return to normal. But nothing normal leaves footprints where no one walks. Nothing normal breathes through cracks in the floorboards when you're wide awake. And nothing normal leaves a door under the chapel that wasn't. There the day before, it started with the smell. Not rot exactly, more like wet iron and old wood, mixed with something sour and earthy. I was sweeping out the chapel at dusk a chore. I did more out of habit than necessity, when I noticed a seam in the floor I hadn't seen before. It ran between the pews, a fine crack in the wood that stretched about 8 feet long, just wide. Enough to slip a dime into. Curious, I ran the bristle end of the broom along it. That's when I heard the hollow clunk. I knelt down, brushing away a fine layer of dust. And sure enough, there was a handle. Old iron. Recessed into the floor. Rusted, but solid. It hadn't been disturbed in a long time. Looking back, though, I should have walked out of that chapel and never looked back. Everything in my body told me not to touch it, but I was past the point of good judgment. The more I tried to ignore what was happening around me, the more the dark pushed back. I had to see what was underneath. I had to understand why Elias wrote what he did in that damn notebook. I gripped the handle, braced my foot against the pew, and pulled. The trapdoor opened with a groan like something waking from a long, hateful sleep. The air that rushed up wasn't just stalid, was heavy, like it had weight, like it had been waiting. A narrow staircase led down into the dark, winding out of view. I lit the lantern, not the flashlight, not the overheads, and stepped inside. The light swelled as I descended, brighter than usual, almost too bright, casting long, warped shadows that moved a fraction slower than they should have. At the bottom of the steps, I found a room. It wasn't large, maybe 10 by 10, with stone, walls, and a dirt floor. The walls were lined with wooden shelves holding dozens of jars, mismatched glass, old medicine bottles all filled with dark liquid. Floating inside were scraps of paper, locks of hair, tiny bones, coins like the ones in Elise's coat. I didn't touch any of them. Couldn't. There was something about the air in that room, a pressure in the center of my skull, like being underwater too long. Something in that place didn't want to be disturbed. But in the center of the room was what stopped me cold, a circle carved into the floor. Perfect, deliberate, maybe 6 feet across. Inside it, etched in the dirt, were dozens of names. Some I recognized from the graves above, others weren't on any headstones. At the center of the circle sat a blackened stone, like obsidian, smooth and cold. Lying across it was a cloth bundle. I knelt and slowly unwrapped it. Inside was a second lantern. It was nearly identical to the one I carried every night, but older, somehow heavier. The glass was cracked in 2 places, and the wick inside looked untouched, unused. But the strangest part was the tag tied to its handle, a yellowed scrap of card with a single sentence written in the same hand as Elias's notebook. When the bearer fails, light this and pray it listens. I didn't take it, not then. Something about touching it felt final, like a door I couldn't shut once opened. I backed out of that room, sealing the trapdoor behind me, then sat in the chapel. Pews for a long time, shaking. My mind went to pieces, trying to fit what I'd seen into something that made sense. Didn't. But a few things became terrifyingly clear. Elias hadn't just been keeping watch, he'd been holding something back. Now that I was the one carrying the lantern, it was my turn. I returned to the cabin just before dawn, found the notebook open on my table, though I'd left it locked in the drawer. A new line had been written in the same tight scrawl. If you see them walk, it's already too late. That was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with simple hauntings or ghost stories. There were rules here. Old ones, maybe older than the town itself. I was breaking them just by surviving. The next few nights blurred together, more graves disturbed, more strange symbols appearing on the stones. Names rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking. One night I saw my own name etched into a headstone that had been blank just hours before. The date was wrong. It said I'd died 2 days from then. When I came back in the morning to double check, the stone was blank again. But I didn't forget. I couldn't. I tried warning Pastor Mullins, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. I asked him directly what Elias had protected, what the lantern truly kept at bay, and he told me the same phrase he'd used before. It was never for the living. I asked him what that meant, really meant, and he just said, "You'll know when they stop whispering and start knocking." I thought he was being poetic again, till the next night when they did. Just after 2 a.m. I heard it. Not whispers, not humming, knocking, not on the door, not on the windows, on the ground. Beneath me, 3 knocks. Then silence. Then again, closer, louder, rhythmic, like something was rising. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat by the window, with the lantern lit, waiting, notebook open in my lap. Knowing now that the worst part wasn't what was coming, but that Elias had once made a deal to hold it back, and now had to choose. Keep the light alive, or take the second lantern from under the chapel, light it, and hope that whatever it summoned would listen to me the way it went. It once listened to him. The knocking didn't stop. Every night, it returned closer, sharper, more deliberate. Wasn't random. It wasn't the groan of old roots or the distant thud of deer on the hill. These were structured, patterned knocks, always in threes, always beneath the oldest graves. I marked the spots each time I heard it, and the pattern became clear. They were surrounding the Bishop Platelisa's family and forming a circle, a boundary maybe, or a warning. And with every night that passed, the knocking moved outward, like something was expanding from the inside. I couldn't do it alone anymore. I went back to the sheriff. It wasn't a conversation, I stormed into his office and slammed Elias's notebook on the desk, jabbing my finger at the line that said, "When the bearer fails, light this and pray it listens." I asked him, point blank, if he knew what was happening. And for once, Greeley didn't dodge. He sat back in his chair, closed his eyes, and said something I'll never forget. "You weren't the first to carry the lantern, and you won't be the last. But if you screw this up, you might be the last one left." He told me the truth, or at least part of it. Maple Hollow had always buried its dead in that valley, long before the town had a name, long before there were roads. The land had been given, not taken, offered by a group of early settlers who believed certain ground was not meant to be walked on, but watched over. The lantern wasn't just tradition, it was a warning light, a boundary marker, Elias. And the caretakers before him weren't just gravediggers, they were keepers of the pact. So long as the lantern burned from dusk till dawn, the dead beneath stayed quiet. Not because they were at peace, because they were bound. And if the flame went out, it wasn't that they would wake, it was that the thing keeping them asleep would stop holding them. I asked why no one warned me, why they'd let a kid with no idea of the danger take over. And Greeley just shrugged and said, "Elias was supposed to train you, but he vanished too soon." Then he stood and walked me to the door like we'd been talking about farm weather. I asked him if the church knew, if the pastor was involved. Greeley's answer was a hard stare and 4 words. "Everyone knows but you." When I returned to the cemetery, the chapel door was open. I hadn't left it that way. The trapdoor inside was unsealed. The second lantern, the backup one Elias had hidden beneath the floor, was sitting on the altar. Lit, glowing blue, not orange, not gold. Blue, like the flame of a welding torch, but soft and cold. I didn't touch it. Something about that flame felt wrong, not evil, just other. Like it didn't belong in this world. Or maybe I didn't belong in the world it came from. That's when I heard the sound of shovels. It's not one. Multiple. Digging in rhythm, far off, but real. I rushed. Out into the dark, my lantern high, the original flame flickering in protest. As I crossed the rows, I saw movement, not shadows, not tricks of light figures. 6, maybe more, walking between the stones. They weren't frantic. They weren't moaning or reaching out like in those cheap horror flicks. They were calm, like they'd done this before, like they had a destination. I ran to the bishop plot. The soil was caved in Nilius's grave. The one without a marker was open. No casket inside, no bones. It's just a black, empty hole that breathed cold air. The lantern in my hand dimmed to a thread of light, backed away, slowly feeling something gather behind me, like a wave ready to crash. And then, behind me, a voice. "You lit it too late." I turned, expecting a person, a face, something human, but there was nothing. Just that voice, low and dusty, like it came from beneath the ground. It repeated, slower this time. "You lit it, too late." That's when I saw them, all of them standing just beyond the cemetery's tree line. Not ghosts, not skeletons, watchers. That's what I called them. Dull. Unmoving figures cloaked in shadow, faces obscured, watching from the edge. They didn't move, they didn't speak, but I knew they were there to collect. And something in my blood told me they weren't here for me, they were waiting for Elias. I fled to the chapel, slammed the trapdoor shut, and grabbed the second lantern. The flame didn't flicker, it didn't warm, but the moment I held it, the knocking stopped. Outside, silence fell over the cemetery. My breath caught in my chest. Had I stopped it? Was it over? Stepped outside, lantern in hand. The grave was still open. The watchers were still there, but nothing moved. Not until the lantern flame flared brighter, almost too bright, and the watchers bowed their heads in unison, then vanished. Gone, just like that. The grave remained open, but the air no longer pulled at me. It was as if something had been satisfied. I didn't sleep. I sat by the grave until dawn, both lanterns beside me. When the sun rose, the second lantern went dark without warning. The original one sputtered back to life on its own, and the grave that had been open was filled. Fresh soil, No shovel marks. No tracks. Just packed, damp earth. And atop the soil was a single offering coin, freshly stamped, with my name on it. It's been 3 weeks since that night, and I haven't slept for more than a few hours at a time. Every time I close my eyes, I see the watchers at the tree line, still as statues, heads lowered, waiting for something I can't name. The second lantern has remained cold since the night it burned blue. I wrapped it in oilcloth and locked it inside a footlocker beneath the chapel. I haven't touched it since. I can't even bring myself to stand near it for more than a few seconds. It hums with a kind of quiet dread, like it remembers what it was lit for and resents being put away. I still carry the first lantern every night. The original one Ellis's. I clean the glass, trim the wick, keep the oil topped off. I've even started saying a kind of prayer before lighting it, though I don't think it's a prayer to anything holy. Just words, old words, borrowed from Elias's notebook and spoken out of fear. Some nights the flame burns low no matter how much oil I use. On those nights, I double the rounds, stay moving, and never let my back face the bishop plot for too long.
Ow.
The air feels heavier when the flame dims, like it's fighting something I can't see. The town's still quiet. Too quiet. No one mentions Elias anymore. No one asks how I'm holding up. The pastor nods when he sees me but doesn't speak. Sheriff Greeley stopped visiting altogether. Sometimes I think they're afraid I might ask for help again. They know they have nothing left to give. Whatever bargain their ancestors struck with whatever lies beneath this place, it's mine now. That much is clear. Elias vanished, and the watchers nearly took him back. I was late, but not too late. And I think that's the only reason they didn't come closer. The light came on just barely, and that was enough. For now, but the signs are starting again. It's small things at first, like before. Missing items, rearranged stones. A second voice calling my name when I pass the chapel. It always sounds like someone I know, my mother once, my old boss from Richmond another time. But I know better than to answer. Elias wrote that down too. They lie with familiar voices. If you answer, they follow. So I keep my head down and I don't speak to shadows. A few days ago I received a package. No return address, just my name, scrawled in crooked block letters. Inside was a pocket watch Elisa's, I think. It's old, silver, and ticks, with that slow, deliberate rhythm I remember from childhood visits to the Bishop Chapel. Only now, it doesn't show the correct time. The hour hand doesn't move at all. The second hand ticks normally, then backward, then stops. And at exactly 3:17 a.m. every night since I opened the box, the watch chimes. Not a bell, not a mechanical ring. It sounds like a shovel hitting earth. 3 times. Then silence. I tried burying the watch beneath one of the old oaks, deep under a flat stone where the ground's thick with roots. But the next night, it was back sitting on the edge of my pillow, ticking louder than ever. There was a note. This time, small and yellowed, tucked beneath the chain. Didn't recognize the handwriting. It simply read, "Your turn, Curtis. Keep the graves quiet." That's when it hit me. This was never a job. Not really. It's a chain. Passed from one bearer to the next. A name written in the dirt to bind the living to the dead. I never accepted the deal, but I stepped into it. That was enough. The lantern chose me, and now I'm part of whatever Elias gave his life to maintain. By the watchers, or if he found a way to disappear before they reached him. But I do know he left the second lantern behind for a reason. He knew failure was coming.
Ow.
And now I know something else. Something worse. They're not just waiting at the edge of the cemetery anymore. 2 nights ago, I saw one of them across the road standing behind the tree line near the town limits, just watching. And last night, there were boot prints in the dirt outside my cabin. Not mine, not Greeley's. Too wide, too deep. I followed them around the perimeter of the cemetery, until they stopped at a grave that hadn't been disturbed in over 70 years. A grave that, according to the records, never had a body in it. And now, even during the day, I keep hearing it, that faint, rhythmic knock beneath my feet. It's weaker in daylight, but it's there. Measured, patient, counting down. So every Night I light the lantern, no matter what. I walk the rows, check the stones. I whisper the old words, because if I miss a night, if I fall asleep too long, if I drop the flame or run out of oil, ... I don't think they'll wait another generation. The dead here don't rest, they wait. And the light. It's not to show me where I'm going, it's to keep them from coming back. Most folks come to small towns to escape noise. City lights, sirens, crowds. They want to hear birds again, maybe the wind in the trees. But here in Orville's Crossing, nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, there's one sound we were always told to ignore: the ringing of the grave bells. It's not because it wasn't real, but because if you heard it, you'd already been chosen. I know that sounds dramatic. I used to think so too. I moved here 4 years ago after retiring early from the Army with a bad knee and a worse temper. My wife had passed, I had no kids, and the VA checks barely kept the lights on in Richmond. So when my cousin Bobby called from Orville's and said the old gravedigger position had opened up full-time, benefits, housing included, packed my tools, kissed the city goodbye, and headed for the hills. Looking back though, maybe the real reason I came was because something in me wanted quiet, something final, that kind of tired no amount of sleep could fix. The cemetery here is old, real old. Pre-Civil War, most of it. You can barely read half the stones, and the ones you can read say things like "fell ill from the air" or "gone to the mountain." The place sits right up against a sheer rise of shale and laurel scrub, hemmed in by woods that grow too thick for comfort. But what makes it different from any other graveyard I've seen are the bells. Tiny bronze bells, each one attached to a cord that runs down into the coffin. A tradition from back when people feared being buried alive. Some were even paranoid enough to be interred with food, a candle, or a revolver, though that last one's just hearsay. Each bell sits on a wrought iron rod, thin and weather-bent, sticking out a few feet above the headstone. Well, most of them are silent now, rusted to hell and back. But the town still keeps up the practice. Every new grave gets a cord. Every coffin has a string running from inside the lid. And I'm the one who threads them. I didn't ask questions at first. I'd seen weirder stuff, overseas shrines in the middle of nowhere, soldiers carrying bones for luck, entire villages where folks swore ghosts could drown you in your sleep. Orville's odd little bell tradition seemed quaint by comparison. I figured it gave people peace of mind. Let them feel connected to their dead. And for my first few months, that's all it was. A quiet job, regular hours, a cottage on the hill with a decent view. The townsfolk were polite in a distant way. Not warm, not cold, just used to minding their own. But in the second winter, things changed. It started with a sound, faint, a soft ringing in the dark. Not wind chimes, not a phone. The specific, unmistakable ping of one of the mourners' bells being pulled. I lived close enough to the graveyard that I could hear them if the wind was right, but that night there was no wind, just snow and stillness. The sound came around midnight. It's just one bell ringing 4 times. Then silence. I went out with a flashlight, thinking maybe a branch had fallen or some teenager was screwing around. I checked every row. Nothing out of place. No footprints, no fallen branches. Now, the bell itself. The bell itself, 3rd row near the old Duncan family plot, hung perfectly still. No ice on the string. No movement at all. It gave me the creeps, sure, but I didn't report it. Didn't want to be the city vet who spooks easy. The next night, I heard it again. Same time, same bell. 4 chimes. Then nothing. I watched from my window this time, a thermos of coffee in hand, and my knee throbbing like hell from the cold. Expected to see movement. Some prankster or animal. But again, nothing. It's just the bell ringing with no cause. I told myself it was settling metal or frost making the cord tighten. Maybe the ground shifting as the snowpack changed. But that third night, the third night changed everything. It wasn't just the Duncan bell. For others rang. Not all at once, no. That would have been easy to dismiss. They rang one after the other, always in the same pattern. 4 rings, pause. 4 rings, pause. I marked the times in a notebook. Midnight exactly, then 12:06, then 12:13, then 12:17, each one a few minutes apart. I followed the sound again, this time with my service pistol tucked in my coat. My breath steamed in the air, and the grave markers stood like crooked teeth under the snow. The first 3 bells I checked had no strings anymore. The cords had been cut, clean, no fraying, and no animal chew marks. Just gone, as if they'd never been attached. I reported it to the sheriff the next morning. Old Charlie Gellert is a 3rd-generation local and never did trust outsiders. He let me finish talking, then nodded once and said, "You didn't touch the bells, did you?" I told him no. He just looked at me for a long while and said, "Good. Don't." That was the end of that conversation. No notes, no follow-up, no explanation. I tried to push, but he just said something that chilled me worse than the snow. If it was them ringing, we'd all know. We wait. That's when it hit me he believed the bells could really ring from inside. Someone buried beneath the earth might actually still have something to say. And worse, he thought there was something out there that might ring them instead. I should have walked away then. Got in the truck, left the keys in the cottage, and gone. Back to wherever people die quietly. But I didn't. I told myself I was just being paranoid. But I kept hearing those bells, and I kept writing down the patterns. And slowly, I started to see it. The order, the timing, the way each bell rang in a clockwise arc around a central. Grave 1 that hadn't had a burial in over 70 years, that grave has no name. Just a marker with a carving of a bell on it, a bigger one. A mourner's bell turned upside down. The first thing people ask when they hear about the bells is, do they really think folks still get buried alive? And I get it, it sounds ridiculous. With embalming, modern medicine, autopsies, there's a 1,000 safeguards. Here in Orville's Crossing, it's not about safety anymore. It's about tradition. And if I'm being honest, fear. You don't grow up in a town like this without absorbing certain rules, whether they're written down or not. And in Orville's, if someone dies, you bury them with a bell, end of story. I've heard all kinds of excuses for it. Some people claim it's a comfort for the living. Others say it's a holdover from Appalachian folklore where the soul could get confused in death and need a tether to the world of the living. But the way folks here behave, I think it's deeper. You can feel it at funerals. The weight of it. The way nobody watches as the string is threaded through the coffin lid, tied to the hand of the body. It's done in silence. No one talks while I run the cord. No one makes eye contact while I slide the little bell over the wrought iron pole and check the tension. It's precise, 2-3 feet of cord. Natural hemp, never nylon. No knots, except a triple twist around the wrist. The bells are tested before and after burial, rung once, never more. And once the casket's in the ground, the bell is left. Alone. That's the rule. Don't touch the bell once it's been rung. What nobody told me when I took this job, at least not outright, was that these aren't just tokens. They're warnings. I didn't see that at first. I thought the bells were symbolic, maybe spiritual. But there's a pattern in how they're used. Every older family in town is buried on the south side of the ridge, where the bells sit higher, catch the wind more easily. Every newer grave since about the 1980s is placed lower. It's closer to the laurel thickets. And those newer bells, they're heavier, thicker cords, tighter pulls, less likely to ring by accident. Like someone wanted to make sure they didn't move. When I asked the funeral director, Miss Linda Hay, why they were built different, she gave me a smile so tight it looked painful. We just want the quiet ones to stay that way. Now, I'm not saying I believe in undead nonsense. I'm a rational man. I've seen bodies, too many of them. I know what dead looks like, smells like, feels like. But what you learn in combat is that death isn't always the end. Sometimes it lingers. In the eyes of your squad mates, in your own bones, in the way some places remember. Orville's Crossing is one of those places. The kind where people speak softer near the graveyard, where children cross themselves, passing the church, even if their parents aren't Catholic, and where no one walks the south slope after dark. That's not superstition, it's survival. I'll skip the boring day-to-day about maintenance. Shoveling snow, checking fence lines, keeping the headstones clear of lichen. What matters is the bells. I was expected to do weekly inspections, but not of the cords, just the rods. Make sure they're upright, not leaning, not rusted through. The strings themselves, off limits. I wasn't even supposed to touch the bell pull, unless it was part of a new burial. And if one broke, I had to file a report, notify the town council, and wait for approval before I could fix it. Seemed ridiculous. Overly formal, but now I think they wanted to record something they could track, or maybe something they could hide. About 2 weeks after I reported the ringing, I got my first special instruction. It came from the sheriff's office, tucked into an envelope taped to my door. The inside was a single page, a diagram of the graveyard with 6 plots marked in red, and the words, "Do not engage if bells activate." No explanation, no names. Just red circles around 6 specific graves, older than I am. I recognized one of them immediately. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. The bell marker with no name. The one carved with an upside-down bell. I showed the diagram to Linda Hay. She paled and told me quietly that those 6 graves were part of a different plot. Closed family records, she said. Then she apologized. For what I still don't know, but she handed me a tiny key and told me to unlock the chapel cellar if I ever saw more than 3 bells ring at once. "There's a ledger down there," she whispered, "but only read it if you absolutely have to." I asked her what she meant by have to. She just said, "If the soil starts moving." Still thought maybe this was a town-wide prank. Some kind of initiation, way to scare the outsider, test the new gravedigger. But that theory didn't hold water the night I saw someone standing in the graveyard just past midnight. Not walking, not doing anything. Standing near the Duncan plot, head bowed, facing the bell. I turned on the floodlights and rushed, out with my boots half laced. But by the time I got there, the figure was gone. No prints, no broken twigs. Nothing but a still swinging bell and a faint earthy smell like wet cloth and old mulch. The weirdest part? I hadn't heard it ring, but it was moving. I went back to the map and double-checked. Duncan's plot wasn't one of the red-circled graves, but it was between 2 of them. It's almost exactly in the middle. I opened my notebook and started writing. Times, names, ring patterns, wind direction. And slowly, something started to emerge. It wasn't just random. The bells were being used in sequence, as if something or someone was using them to mark a path. That's when I remembered a detail I hadn't thought much about: the cords. Every one of them was made by hand, braided by the same person. Miss Hay mentioned once that there was only one person in town still trained to weave them properly. And she said properly like it mattered in a way I hadn't understood until now. I went back to my old VA-issued file box that night, dug out my flashlight, and tested every bell I could reach without crossing the red-marked graves. I expected silence, but the Duncan bell, it didn't just chime. It pulled. Like something under the soil had yanked the cord tight when I touched it, hard enough to cut the skin on my fingers. And then, just for a moment, I heard breathing, not minded. Wasn't until the first full burial I supervised that I understood how strange this job really was. Sure, I'd been in Orville's Crossing for a few months already. I'd helped with maintenance, fence repairs, even lowering a few caskets into the ground. But I hadn't yet been the one responsible for the full bell setup, start to finish. Not until Marla Jenner died. She was a widow in her late 70s, lived on the west edge of town, no kids, no visitors. Died in her sleep. Peaceful, the coroner said. Natural causes. I didn't know her, but I saw her name pop up in the service list taped to the town hall bulletin board. And 2 days later, I got the delivery of her coffin and supplies with a handwritten note from Linda Hay. Use cord pattern. Number A. Rod already assigned B22. The numbers didn't mean much to me then. I figured it was just how they kept inventory straight. But cord pattern number 3 turned out to be a specific braid thicker than usual, with a tighter twist, almost like a noose. It took me an hour just to thread the thing through the lid slats of the coffin, and secure it around the waxy, cold fingers of the deceased. It didn't sit right with my tying a string to a dead woman's hand, knowing it might twitch or move if something settled wrong. But I followed directions. The bell went on the iron rod, like they always do, and I made sure the tension on the cord was enough to lift it a half-inch when pulled. The funeral was quiet. Only 6 people came, 2 from the church, 1 distant niece, and 3 town officials who stood in the back and didn't speak a word. There was no music, just the pastor's soft voice and the crunch of snow under boots. I lowered the casket myself. When the bell rang once, as tradition allowed, it felt like something final had snapped in my gut. The cord tightened, then loosened, and I filled in the grave in silence. The town folks left before the last shovel of dirt was packed down. They didn't even glance back at the stone. I stayed after watching the bell, just standing there waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just signed off on something older than a death certificate. The whole process had been ritualistic, exact, without warmth. The church didn't offer a meal afterward. The obituary never ran in the paper. It was like Marla Jenner had been absorbed, not buried. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with her burial log in front of me, staring at the entry. Plot B22, pattern number 3, single ring at 3:14 p.m., witnessed by T. Carter, and under that written, in a different hand, was a line I hadn't seen before, marked for monitoring. I'll skip the boring arguments I had with myself afterward. The ones where I told myself I was just reading too much into things, that the note was a clerical detail, that every town has its quirks. But when I visited B22 the next morning, the cord had changed. I swear to God, wasn't the one I tied. Same length, sure, same pole. But the braid was looser, as if someone had untied and rethreaded it in the night. And the soil, it wasn't settled. It looked churned, not dug up dash, just ... disturbed. I told myself I'd fix it. I'd swap out the cord, tighten the line, tamp down. The dirt. But when I touched the rod to lift the bell, the whole pole snapped in half in my hands. The metal was rotted through, not rusted, rotted, like it had aged 100 years overnight. The inside was hollow, crumbly. It left a dark residue on my palms that I couldn't wash off for 3 days. I took the broken piece to Linda Hay. She didn't seem surprised. She asked if I'd heard anything the night before. I said no. Looked relieved, almost disappointed. Then she said something that stopped me cold. We don't expect the first one to ring. The second's the one that matters. When I asked her what that meant, she wouldn't explain. Just said I should. Keep my ears open around 3 a.m., that's when the old bells stir. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, eyes locked on the hill, every light in the house on radio playing static low in the background. I waited, watched the frost crawl up the panes, checked the time every 2 minutes, and then, at 3:17 a.m., I heard it. A bell clear and soft rang once. Then again, it's 3 short chimes. I stood so fast, I knocked over the coffee mug, heart pounding in my chest like a hammer. I ran outside, boots half-laced, coat flapping. The bell at B22 was still, absolutely still. But the one beside it, WASN, plot B21. Unmarked, no name. No obituary, no burial date in the logs, and its cord? It wasn't hemp. It was a frayed ribbon, bleached white, threaded straight into the soil with no pole. And when I knelt to touch it, I felt the ground underneath pull once, like something exhaling. After the night I heard the bell at B21, things started slipping out of place. Not in a dramatic way, not at first, just little things. Always left by the back door started showing up covered in red clay from the south side of the cemetery, even though I hadn't walked that slope in days. A set of keys went missing from my jacket pocket and reappeared dangling from the bell. Rod over Marla Jenner's grave, gently swaying, even though there wasn't a lick of wind. At first, I chalked it up to exhaustion. I'd been running on caffeine and half-sleep for weeks, writing down every strange detail like I was piecing together a riddle. But I was missing something bigger, something that had less to do with the bells and more with who was using them. It was the dogs that made me really pay attention, or rather the lack of them. Orville's had a lot of strays, always had. Little mutts wandering around town, sleeping under porches, sniffing around the graveyard fence. But one morning, they were just ... gone. No howling. No paw prints in the snow, just silence. Even the birds stopped calling in the early hours. It's when I noticed the bells didn't ring anymore during the day. Not in the wind, not by accident. And that silence wasn't peace, it was avoidance. Like everything. With a sense knew not to make noise around the graves anymore. Then there were the visitors folks I'd never seen before. They didn't fit the mold of small-town locals. They were pale, soft-spoken, dressed in outdated clothes like they'd walked out of a church photo from 50 years ago. They never stayed long, just wandered among the older rows, stopping at certain stones, staring down for a minute, then moving on. One man in particular caught my eye. Thin, tall, wore a dark coat even though it was warm that day. I asked if he was looking for someone, turned, nodded politely, and said, "I was just making sure the string's still tied." Then he smiled in a way that didn't touch his eyes and walked off. I followed him to the front gate. He passed through it. But when I turned the corner seconds later, he was gone. Vanished. No car. No footprints. Just gone. That's when it hit me some of the people I was seeing weren't visitors. They weren't alive. They were part of the same system as the bells, participants, overseers maybe? I don't know what to call them, but their presence wasn't passive. They were checking, marking time, like clock hands moving unseen, making sure everything was still in place. I'll skip the few days where I tried to ignore it, all shoving the bell logs into a drawer, avoiding the South Hill, pretending I didn't hear things under the floorboards. At night, but avoidance doesn't work in Orville's. The silence always finds you. And it did on the 5th night after B21 chimed. That was when I got the envelope. It was slipped under my door sometime during the night, heavy parchment folded, tight, sealed with wax stamped in the shape of a bell turned on its side. Inside was a map hand-drawn showing the layout of the cemetery, but not how I'd ever seen it before. This map was circular, with plots arranged like spokes on a wheel. At the center, a name I'd never heard before, Jonas Mayer. The margin, a note in the same cramped handwriting as the grave reports, "Bell must ring again before the 12th night. Failure to ring will result in breach." I brought the map to Linda Hay the next morning. She stared at it like I'd handed her a lit match. Her hands shook as she folded it back up. "Where did you get this?" she asked. But when I told her, she just said, "Burn it and forget it." But I didn't burn it. I couldn't. Something about it felt official. Like it wasn't a warning, it was a schedule. A ritual plan handed down to someone who now had a role, whether he understood it or not. That night, I walked the southern hill. The part with the 6 graves I'd been warned not to touch. The bells there weren't just quiet, they were wrong. Each rod was bent slightly inward, like something had leaned against it from beneath. The cords were slack, buried too deep to see the ends. The earth was hard, frozen, even though it hadn't dipped below freezing in days, and the trees around. Those graves, they bent away from them, growing in arcs that should have taken decades to form, all pulling back from the center like something was pressing outward. I heard something then, not a voice, a sound like someone humming inside a locked room. Had a shape, a rhythm, 3 notes, soft and low, repeating again and again, coming from beneath the dirt. I backed away, flashlight flickering in my hand, and as I passed B21 again, I saw something I can't explain. The cord was glowing, just faintly, like moonlight trapped in thread. It pulsed with each note of the hum, as though the sound was moving through it. That's when I understood. The bells weren't warnings. They were responses. Something down there was calling, and the bells answered. Not all of them, just the ones tied to whoever or whatever still knew how to ring. And the cord I had tied around Marla Jenner's wrist, it was tightened. It all snapped into focus the day I found the ledger. Linda had warned me not to go into the chapel basement unless I had to, and I'd taken her seriously till I realized that "had to" wasn't a clear line. It crept up on you. It was a one moment where I said to myself, now is the time. It just happened. The bells kept ringing. The map stayed burned into my thoughts. I started seeing things that couldn't be explained, graves with no records. Cords tied in patterns no one had taught me, and footprints near the oldest plots where no one had walked in decades. One night I found a stone that had shifted 6 inches west. Another night, the name carved into that same stone had changed from Jonas Mare to a waiting ring. So I took the chapel key Linda had given me and went down into the cellar. It smelled like dust and oil. The air was thick, unmoving, like it hadn't been disturbed in a century. There were shelves of old hymnals, boxes of candle stubs, rusted. Altar tools, but tucked behind a false panel under the stairwell, I found a lockbox. Inside was the ledger, thick, hand-bound, older than anything else in the building. I sat on a stool with a flashlight and opened it, half afraid something would whisper from the pages the moment I cracked the spine. What I found was worse than any whisper. It wasn't just a burial log. It was a record of exchanges. Its entry listed a date, a name, a plot number, a bell designation. And then written in deep red Inca word, given, taken, or withheld. And in a separate column, there were descriptions I couldn't make sense of. Not at first. Words like pulse faint, soil warm, or cord seized during descent, or responds to name when spoken before twilight. These weren't medical notes. Were observations as if the gravediggers weren't burying people, but managing something more, active, something they weren't just trying to contain, something they were trying to keep pleased. That's when it hit. Meath, this wasn't about preventing someone from waking up in a coffin. This was about tracking who might be called back. Or worse, who never left in the first place. I'll skip the pages of copied names and hand-scribbled codes, but there was one section that stood out. It had its own divider and a title carved into the thick paper bellways. Beneath it were 6 entries, each with the same words stamped at the top. Bell initiated from below. Acceptable breach. Rebound completed. I recognized the plot numbers. Immediately. The 6 graves circled in red on the map. The one Sheriff Gellert told me never to touch. I flipped to the final entry. The page was blank, except for a single phrase, handwritten in newer ink. 7th begins when Mare is complete. The name Jonas Mare again. That same name carved onto the nameless grave with the upside down bell. From that moment on, I stopped thinking of the bells as safety measures. They were signposts. And someone or something had been ringing them from below. That realization sank in like a cold iron weight. If they were ringing back, then they weren't just protecting us. They were communicating, reaching up, not to beg for rescue, but to signal a readiness, to be taken out, to change places. That same night, I checked on B-22 again, Marla Jenner's grave. The cord had changed color. I swear it. What had once been dull tan hemp was now a deeper, oily brown, like it had been soaked in something. Not blood, not water, something else. And the bell, the rod had warped, slightly bowed, like something below had pushed hard against the cord from within the coffin. But when I tugged on the line gently, the string pulled back. It wasn't slack. It resisted. I staggered back in the snow, falling into the next row. I didn't touch that cord again the following morning. I drove to the town archives, the closest thing we had to a library. I asked to see burial permits, casket invoices, anything from the last 50 years. Most were missing. Woman named Rosie, always pleasant before, grew pale when I asked about Mare. She told me there had never been a Jonas Mare in Orville's. It's not living, not dead. I asked how that could be, since there was a headstone with his name. She didn't answer. She just got up and locked the record room door behind her. That night, someone left another envelope on my doorstep. Same wax seal, no map this time. Just one sentence written on a square of paper in that same familiar handwriting. If you hear 6, don't wait for 7. And that's when the real horror of it sunk in. The bells weren't an old mistake. They were part of a system. A relay. A countdown. And Mayor wasn't a person. He was a trigger. I went out at midnight, armed with 2 flashlights and a can of lamp oil for the chapel lantern. Checked every marked grave, every string, every rod. The snow was untouched. Everything was still. But just before I turned back, I passed plot B21, the unmarked one that had first glowed faintly. The ribbon was gone, the cord, the marker, the pole vanished, like it had never been there. In its place, a shallow depression in the soil, and a line of faint impressions in the frost footprints. Barefoot, leading. Outward? I didn't sleep the night I found the barefoot prints. I didn't even go back inside the cottage. I stood in the cold, watching the dark line of the forest past the far edge of the cemetery, listening for anything bells, breathing, the low hum I'd heard before. But nothing came. Just the wind and the creak of the iron rods swaying gently in their soil anchors. And yet, I knew in my bones that something had left. Something that wasn't supposed to. Something that had been waiting, patient, beneath the surface until the final signal was given. I walked the entire cemetery twice, flashlight beams skimming every row, boots crunching over fresh snow. By the third pass, I stopped pretending to be thorough. I was scared. I was stalking something I could no longer explain, something that might already be inside the town. Every bell I passed felt louder than before. They didn't ring, but they vibrated a low pressure you couldn't hear so much as feel behind your teeth, under your skin, in the pit of your spine, around 3:12 a.m. I heard it, the 6th bell, not one I'd set, not one on my maps. It came from the north slope near, the forest where no burials had happened in living memory. The sound wasn't right. It was lower, heavier. It didn't chime so much as groan, like iron dragged across stone. It rang once, then again. Then a third time. I broke into a run, flashlight jostling, notebook tucked in my coat, heart hammering in my ears. I reached the slope in less than 2 minutes, but there was no bell, no rod. Just a shallow grave, freshly disturbed, and beside it, an open casket. I stopped so fast I almost slipped. It was just lying there, half sunk in earth, splinters along. The edge of the lid, which had been pushed open from the inside, and inside that coffin wasn't a body. Just a string-braided, hemp-coiled where wrists and hands should have been. The end of it had been pulled so hard, the frayed knot had burned through part of the wood. There was ash on the edges, not rot. I turned to run back toward the chapel, toward the safety of light and locks, but the ground gave beneath me. My right foot sank, almost to the knee, in soft, fresh-dug earth. I felt something wrap around my ankle knot fingers. Not claws, but cord, tightening with impossible force. I dropped the flashlight, fell forward onto my elbows, and kicked wildly, cold panic seizing my chest. The grip around my ankle grew tighter, almost burning through the fabric of my jeans, and I could feel it pulling, not just down but inward. Like it was trying to pull me into a space that shouldn't exist. I reached for the flashlight, found only the notebook. In pure desperation, I yanked the oil can from my coat pocket, unscrewed the cap, and flung the contents backward over my leg, over the grave. The smell of fuel hit the air just as I yanked a lighter from my collar chain and sparked it. The fire caught instantly. It wasn't a bonfire, just a whip of flame, but it screamed. The air itself shrieked, not with a voice, but with the sound. Of earth and cord and intent recoiling, pressure on my ankle released, and I crawled out, tearing away from the smoldering edge. When I looked back, the earth was untouched. Smooth, no hole, no string, no casket. But the fire had left a mark in the snow, a perfect circle of scorched white, like an imprint. And in the center, a melted bronze bell, no bigger than my palm. That was when I finally accepted it. There had never been just one purpose for those bells. They weren't there to protect the living or alert rescuers. They were channels, each one a two-way passage. And I had just interrupted a crossing. I sprinted to the chapel, hands numb, lungs screaming. I locked the doors, turned on every light I could find, and bolted the trapdoor to the cellar twice over. I didn't sleep. I didn't blink for hours. And when the morning came, I checked the main graveyard. The bell at B22 Marla Jenner's grave was gone. No rod, no cord, no marker. Only a folded scrap of paper on top of the grave. The same kind I'd seen before. On it, just 3 words. Next is yours. I drove to town hall that morning, slammed the ledger onto the receptionist's desk, and demanded, "To see the mayor?" There wasn't a mayor. Not really. It's just a governing committee, none of whom were available. I showed the woman at the desk the record of mayor, of the 6 bellways, the footprint photos, the burned cord. She didn't flinch. She simply reached under the desk and handed me another envelope. No wax seal this time, just a plain white slip. Inside was a second set of cemetery keys, and a single instruction, mark the 7th. That's when it hit. This wasn't a haunting. This was a rotation, a cycle, a ritual of replacement. Every bell that rang wasn't just a soul returning. It was another one taking their place, and now that 6 had rung, ... they were waiting for the 7th. I haven't heard a bell ring in over 8 nights. Not one chime, not even a tremble in the wind. At first I thought that meant it was over that. I had done enough. That maybe burning the cord, interrupting whatever that thing was beneath the north slope, had broken the cycle. But now I understand the silence isn't relief. It's a pause, breath held. A calm before something bigger. The townspeople won't look me in the eye anymore. Not at the grocery store, not at the gas station. Even Linda Hay, who once gave me her quiet warnings and brittle smiles, won't return my calls. I passed her on Main Street 2 days ago, and she crossed the road without a word. It wasn't fear, it was resignation, like she knew what I was now, or what I was about to be. The grave marked Jonas Mayer has been covered. I didn't do it. One morning it was just ... filled. No fresh soil, no backhoe tracks. Just a smooth green mound of turf like it had been there all along. The headstone remains, but the name is gone. Worn down overnight, the lettering stripped to bare stone. Next to a trite, beside where I'd seen the footprints, was a new rod. Wrought iron, freshly welded, painted black. No cord, no bell. Yet, and that's what keeps me awake now. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that they don't bury anyone here without a bell. I went back to the ledger once more, hoping there might be something I'd missed. A loophole, a solution. But the final page was no longer blank. Someone had written in it since I last saw it. Same red ink as before, just one entry. T. Carter 7th. Initiated. I should have been surprised when I saw my name there, but I wasn't. The signs were all there. Strange visitors, the missing dogs, the footprints, the map, the notes. It had always been building to this. I just didn't want to see it. It was never meant to stop the process. It was meant to be woven into it. Now every night I hear the ticking. Not a clock, not a watch, something deeper. Beneath the floorboards, beneath the soil. A rhythm, steady, impatient. Like ropes sliding through unseen hands. Like someone counting down on the other side. And I swear, just before dawn, I hear breathing beneath my bed. Slow, wet, synchronized with the ticking. I haven't touched the new rod. I haven't tied a cord. I haven't rung a bell. But I know it's only a matter of time. I keep the graveyard lit all night now. Every lamp, every candle, every floodlight I can get my hands on. But deep down, I know it won't stop. What's coming? Because I'm not on the outside of this anymore. I am the 7th. And the next time the bells ring, it won't be from the ground. It'll be from me. I hadn't planned on taking over my grandfather's job. Honestly, if you'd asked me a year ago, I would have laughed at the idea. I was halfway through a history degree at a mid-tier college with a half-used dorm meal plan and a growing collection of student loans. My plans didn't include Laurel Rest Memorial Cemetery or Savannah, or being the youngest caretaker in the cemetery's 200-year history. But plans are funny like that. They change when the people you love vanish without warning, Grandpa. Charlie had been the groundskeeper at Laurel Rest since I was little. I spent summers with him, there pulling weeds, scraping moss off headstones, and listening to him rattle off strange, half-true stories about the people buried beneath our feet made it all sound so charming. Mysterious, but never dark. Call it a place where stories slept. He was always out before dawn, always back just before dark, and always kept the cemetery lanterns full. I used to think it was just habit. Now I know it was something closer to duty. He went missing last November. No big announcement. No police alert. Just ... Gone. He left a pot of coffee on the burner. His favorite flannel on the coat hook and his cemetery keys hanging on a nail beside the fridge. No note, no struggle, no prints. They found his truck parked by the back gate of Laurel Rest. With the door open and a half-eaten pimento cheese sandwich in the passenger seat, I came home for the funeral even though there wasn't a body. Held it in the chapel anyway with an empty urn and a photograph propped up on the altar. After the service, the trustees pulled me aside and offered me the job. Full salary, housing included. They even offered to forgive a portion of my grandfather's remaining mortgage debt if I signed a 1-year contract. At the time, I was broke, tired, and still grieving. I told myself I'd only stay until summer, just long enough to get my head straight. I didn't even read the fine print. Looking back, though, I should have asked why they were so eager for me to accept. I moved into the caretaker's house 2 weeks later. It was a squat brick building behind the cemetery's east fence, shaded by an old stand of laurels so thick they blocked most of the morning sun. The inside was clean, but smelled faintly of mildew, an old oilless smell I remembered from childhood, the kind that clings to rags and shed tools. His boots were still. By the door, his hat still hung on the coat rack. Nothing had been packed away. It was as if everyone expected him to walk back in and pick up where he left off. The cemetery itself was beautiful in that gothic, overgrown kind of way. Wrought iron gates, broken angels, mausoleums with cracked faces and fading names. The oldest. Graves dated back to the 1700s, some so old that their inscriptions had eroded into soft swirls. The newer sections were neatly aligned, all polished stone and manicured grass. But even those felt heavy, like the ground held its breath while you walked over it. I didn't notice anything wrong at first. In fact, it was peaceful, quiet in a way I'd almost forgotten. There were no students yelling in the halls, no sirens in the distance, no deadlines to miss. Just the steady rhythm of tending to the dead. It gave me something to focus on. The trustees gave me a binder of instructions, a thick leather thing, full of typed rules and handwritten annotations in Grandpa's careful print. It listed everything from how to maintain the map index to which days to mow certain sections. I flipped through it my first night on the job, sitting at his old kitchen table with a cup of stale coffee and a heavy heart. Most of the notes were expected reminders to trim ivy off the Callahan mausoleum, or replace the oil in the chapel lamps every 3 days. But one section near the back caught my eye. It was labeled rotations. The entries didn't make sense. Each one was dated and followed by a list of plot numbers, not names, just alphanumerics, and the word moved. Sometimes 1 or 2 were marked, sometimes a dozen. Beside each date, my grandfather had written a note, whispered wrong, light missed, soil pulled again. These weren't maintenance issues. They read more like observations. Warnings, maybe? I didn't understand them then, but I didn't forget. I'll skip the boring first week of adjusting to the schedule. Learning which faucets dripped and which switches sparked, how the wind always moved from the north no matter. The forecast. What mattered most was that Laurel Rest felt ... active. Not in a lively way. Not haunted even. It was like living on top of something that remembered more than it should. I found myself waking up at odd hours, always at 2:44 a.m. exactly. No. Dreams. Just a sudden, sharp awareness. It's like something had changed while I was asleep and wanted me to notice then. The first whisper came. I was clearing leaves near the north corner of a section called Shepherd's Row. The graves there were old, worn nearly smooth and tucked under drooping trees. As I worked, brushing debris from the stones, I heard a voice, not loud, not near. A whisper, so faint I thought it was the wind. It said one word, wrong. That's it. One word stretched thin like fabric pulled too tight. I spun around. No one, not even a squirrel. I froze. Every hair on my arm stood up. My chest went tight. And then I noticed the headstone in front of me. Its name had changed. I knew that stone. I'd read it earlier that morning. It said Amos Shepherd, 1821 to 1893. Now it said Annette Lorne, 1844 to 1872. Same stone. Same weathering, same lichen pattern. But a completely different name and date. I backed away slowly. Heartbeat in my ears, and didn't return to that row until the next day. When I did, the name was back to Amos Shepherd, and the whisper gone. But something about the ground there felt deeper than it, the day before, like it had been stirred. After the incident at Shepherd's Row, I told myself it was a mistake. Maybe I'd misread the headstone. Maybe the light had hit it funny. Maybe fatigue was playing tricks on me. But the more I tried to brush it off, the more it clawed at the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the memory of that voice the way. It had said wrong like it was correcting me, like it wasn't angry, just disappointed. So I went to the binder. Grandpa's notes were meticulous. Every row was labeled by letter, every grave by number, with grid markers across the entire Arshire Acre property. I pulled the master layout from the front pocket, a faded but detailed survey map. With every burial listed up through 2018, I cross-referenced Amos Shepherd's grave, row N, plot 14. Then I checked the rotation records in the back section. Sure enough, N14 had been marked twice. Once in 2003, then again in 2017, both times labeled moved with the added note, name keeps reverting. It chilled me. I'd never thought of graves as something that could revert. I started checking other stones. Just a few at first, and then more obsessively. I'd walk a row with the binder in one hand, a flashlight in the other, even in daylight, and confirm each name, one by one. But something was off. Some headstones were newer than they should have been. Others were older than the records claimed. Plot numbers would skip or repeat, and in some cases, graves listed in the binder simply weren't there at all. In their place were stretches of bare grass or clusters of stone that didn't belong to any assigned section. I kept a private notebook of these inconsistencies. At first, it was just a curiosity, a handful of outliers I could blame on bad documentation or weather erosion. But the list kept growing. Dozens of mismatched names, empty plots that weren't supposed to be empty. Crossed out entries in the rotation log with new ones added in different handwriting. Some pages even had whole columns overwritten in what looked like charcoal, not pencil, charcoal. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that whatever was happening here wasn't an accident. This wasn't sloppy record keeping. This was intentional, designed. One day I sat down in the caretaker's shed with the survey map spread out over the workbench. I took a ruler, connected the rotation plots across time, and started tracing lines. It wasn't random. The graves that had been moved weren't. Scattered, they formed a shape, spiral, tight at the center, expanding outward over decades. Like the land was unfolding itself in some kind of slow, calculated rhythm. The name Jonas Dunphy, a Civil War veteran, showed up 3 times along the spiral's edge, even though according to the ledger, he'd only ever been buried once. I'll skip the part where I tried to explain this to the trustees. They gave me the same polite smiles and soft nods they'd given me at the funeral. Mr. Templeton, the oldest of the group, said, "The land is old, Regina. It shifts. We let it do what it does." When I pressed harder, mentioned the voices, the changing names, he just said, "Your grandfather took care of things. You'll learn too as well." That's when it hit. Me, he didn't want answers. He wanted obedience. Like Grandpa had been more than a caretaker, he'd been a handler, a warden. And now they were expecting me to keep the same uneasy peace without even explaining the rules. So I took matters into my own hands. I walked the spiral. Starting at its center and overgrown patch with no visible headstones, I paced its curves using Grandpa's old metal tape, measuring each arc, each deviation, marking them in chalk on the ground as I went. After 5 hours of walking, I returned to the center and found something that made my blood run cold. The tape measure, coiled beside the spot I'd started, had moved. By itself, it was now unspooled in a wide circle around the empty patch, and at its center, dug shallow into the dirt with a trowel I knew I hadn't touched, was a tiny brass plaque, oval-shaped, no bigger than a coaster. Lifted it with my gloves and wiped away the moss. It read, "Reserved. Do not inscribe." No name, no date. Just that. As if the ground was holding space for someone who hadn't died yet, or someone who hadn't stayed dead that night. I dreamt of my grandfather. For the first time since he disappeared. In the dream, he stood outside the chapel at dusk, staring at the laurel trees. He didn't turn when I called his name, just said, "You have to listen to the stones. They get loud when they're hungry." Then he walked into the trees and vanished. I woke up at 2:44 a.m. again, this time to a faint scraping sound under the floorboards, like something shifting in the foundation, dragging itself from one end to the other. I didn't get out of bed. I just lay there, heart hammering, eyes wide, listening. And I swear, just before the noise stopped, I heard my own name whispered from beneath the floor. Regina ... The morning after I heard my name whispered from under the floor, I woke up already sweating. Not from heat, something else. Like the air had gotten thicker overnight, heavy with pressure. The lights in the house flickered when I turned them on, but there hadn't been a storm. I chalked it up to old wiring and pushed myself through. The morning routine, coffee, radio, binder on the table. But the moment I stepped outside, I knew something was wrong. Laurel Rest looked ... wrong. At first glance, nothing dramatic had changed. The chapel was where it had always been. Fences, the trees, the rolling green hills were all still intact, but the paths were off just slightly, like someone had nudged them a few feet in different directions. I couldn't find the gravel footpath that led to Shepherd's Row. Instead, curved toward the Dunfree Mausoleum, which should have been 3 plots west. The Callahan statue, which always faced east, now faced south. And worst of all, the central section where the spiral I'd traced had ended was no longer grass, it was stones. Flat ones, brand new. 10 of them. None of the names were on the master list. I checked twice, even pulled out Grandpa's old GPS and tried to mark coordinates. The readings bounced. The same grave would register in 2 different locations, 5 feet apart. I turned in a slow circle and realized something that made me feel like the ground was falling out from under me. The cemetery wasn't just shifting names, it was adding people. People who weren't on the rolls. People no one had buried. I called the county records office in a panic. I asked about permits, documentation, family notifications, since anything that could explain the new markers. The woman on the phone put me on hold, came back 10 minutes later, and told me there were no scheduled burials in the last 30 days. No headstone orders either. I asked her to check the names I found. Nadine Dorn, Ellis Kep, Clara Thatch, Miles Hurst. None of them showed up in the county death registry. She paused, then asked me, "Are you calling from Laurel Rest?" I said yes. She hung up. That afternoon, I searched the shed again. I needed something, anything left behind by my grandfather that could help me make sense of this. And I found it wedged behind the oil drums in a cracked plastic toolbox. Notes, not tools, cassette tapes. There were 6 in total, and labeled, except for faded stickers with dates from the last 20 years. I had to rummage through the attic to find a working player. But when I finally popped the first one in and pressed play, I heard his voice. "Grandpa Charlie, low calm?" But different than I remembered. Slower. Like he was always glancing over his shoulder. Between words, March 3rd, 2001, he began, "Woke up to 2 new stones today. No calls from town. No requests. No service notices. Checked the plot book, nothing listed. They were smooth, warm to the touch. Soil under M wasn't fresh. Didn't dig. Paused for a long time. Before continuing, I heard someone laugh from inside one of them. Thought it was just in my head, till I came back from the shed and found the gate open. No tracks, no wind. I played that tape 3 times. Then the next. Each one was a confession, a breadcrumb trail. He talked about the spiral, the shifting names, the way the graves seemed to move toward a center point he could never reach. Ow. Sometimes, he'd go to bed after setting flowers on one grave and wake to find the stone gone, entirely replaced with another that shouldn't exist. He'd leave offerings at certain trouble plots, and in return, the layout would stay stable for a while. On the 5th tape, he said something I haven't stopped thinking about since. They remember, he whispered. They remember what happened, what we promised, what we buried that wasn't ever meant to rest. He never said what it was, just that he called it the listener. That it had been under the center stone since before the cemetery was founded. That it used the graves to think, to build patterns, to speak to those willing to hear. That night, I went to the center of the spiral. I brought the tape recorder, a notepad, and one of Grandpa's old lanterns. I stood in the exact spot where I'd found the reserved plaque and waited. Happened for a long time, was about to give up when I heard it again. Not a whisper, a name. My name spoken not from the wind or the trees, but from underneath me. Regina, it said. Clear, soft, familiar. Then another name followed. Not one. I knew. But one that was carved, I now realized, on a headstone that hadn't been there the day before. Jonas Dunphy. And this time, the voice didn't sound disappointed. It sounded ... pleased. There's no real way to explain what it feels like when something changes right in front of you, and everyone else pretends not to notice. And the first time I saw a grave revert in real time, I thought I was losing my mind. I was raking leaves in Section B. Early morning, the fog still clinging to the tips of the grass. I stopped beside a headstone I knew by heart. Marjorie Clennon, 1893 to 1951. I used to lay lilies there every Sunday because Grandpa always had. It was our quiet tradition, honoring a stranger neither of us ever met. I turned to pick up the bundle of fresh-cut flowers, and in less than the span of a breath, the name changed. Not the stone, not the date, just the name. Now it said Rhett Clemens. Same birth year, same death year. Different person, the worst part. I blinked once and it was back to Marjorie Clennon again. It hadn't weathered or faded or crumbled. It rewrote itself right in front of me. I backed away, heart pounding, eyes watering. Air felt heavy, charged with static. The rake handle trembled in my hand. And from the hedges just beyond the mausoleums, I heard them, not one whisper, dozens. They came like a breeze passing through reeds thin, brittle, just above the edge of comprehension. Some laughed, some begged, some just repeated numbers. But one voice was clearer than the rest, and it spoke directly into my left ear, like it was right behind me. We remember. Oh, I spun around, but there was no one, only the creeping hush. That follows when something wants you to know it's watching. I left the tools where they were and walked straight. Back to the caretaker's house. I locked the door. I closed the blinds. I paced. Every few minutes, I'd peek out the kitchen window toward the Clennon grave, but I couldn't even see the stone anymore. The hedges had grown thicker, taller, and naturally so, like they'd been watered with weeks of rain overnight. I decided to check the tapes again. Tape 6. The final one. My grandfather's voice was strained now, more tired than before. You could hear it cracking. April 9th, 2018, he began. The reversions are happening faster now. Stones changing while I'm looking at them. New names every day. The spiral's almost full. I think it's nearly time. He paused, and the tape hissed with quiet. They want a witness. Someone to see it. Someone to carry the shape into the next one. They don't want silence. They want memory. He coughed, long, dry, wheezing. Then added, the ground speaks. Now, not just whispers, it moves. I laid flowers for Annette Lorne and watched her stone crack open like a mouth. It smiled, Reggie. I don't know how else to say it. I saw its teeth. Stopped the tape there. I didn't want to know what he saw after that. Instead, I opened the map again. I traced the spiral pattern, overlaying it with my notes, the grave reversions, the shifting footpaths. And the shape that formed made my stomach turn. It wasn't just a spiral anymore. It was a fingerprint. A massive, etched print that mapped across the cemetery in waves of plot movements and name changes, and the center wasn't empty anymore. I checked the site that had been just bare soil before. This time, a stone stood there tall, dark gray, no weathering. I didn't carve it, no one did. The name on it, Regina Walker. My name, with my birthday. And no death date yet. That's when it hit me. The spiral wasn't random. It was always looking for a center, a focus point, a listener, someone to hold its pattern, to finish the print. And now it had found me. I ran, left the tools, left the binder, left the tape recorder playing static in the corner of the table. I ran through the rows, past the chapel, down the sloping path toward the back gate. The trees whispered my name as I passed. The hedges curled in around my boots. Stones cracked as I sprinted, voices calling from the earth below. But when I reached the gate, it was gone. Not locked. Gone. In its place was more cemetery, more graves, or stones with names I didn't recognize. The land had rearranged itself, or worse, it had grown, and I was inside it now, not walking over it. Inside it every step. I took back toward the caretaker's house, felt like it echoed. Not on stone, it's not on soil, but inside a body that had always been alive and was only now. Waking up the next morning, the cemetery was different again, but not in a subtle way. Not like the name swaps or the path curves or even the weathered faces of statues being turned overnight. This time it looked ... sunken. Whole rows of graves had dipped as if the earth beneath them had exhaled in the night. The stones leaned forward like teeth breaking through old gums. And in the dead center, right where my own name had appeared the day before, there was a new trench and narrow gouge in the ground, no more than 2 feet wide, running nearly 20 yards long. Cutting through the plot lines like a scar, I didn't want to look inside, but I did. What I saw was impossible. It wasn't soil inside the trench. It wasn't even stone. It was something black matte, dry and smooth, like obsidian, but breathing. I could see it expanding and contracting, slow and steady, like a lung or a throat. Indentations covered its surface, organized in the 8. Same spiral I had mapped, and within each ringed pattern, letters, names, etched deep enough to be felt with a fingertip. My name was there again, and next to it new ore still fresh. Carved in grooves that oozed a dark red sheen was Grandpa's name, Charlie Walker. But he hadn't been buried here. No one ever found a body. No funeral, no ashes, no marker. Yet here it was, his name inscribed like it had always been part of the pattern. And it pulsed. Each time I said it out loud, the trench swelled slightly and let out a faint hum, like metal straining against heat. I stumbled backward, slipped on the wet moss near the edge, and nearly tumbled into it. My elbow scraped against a root that hadn't been there seconds ago, jutting up from the earth like a bony hand reaching for the sky. When I caught myself and stood back up, I looked around and saw dozens more roots, arms, fingers, twisting slowly out of the ground. Some grasped tombstones. Some hovered in the air, crooked like antennae. Others gently tapped the earth, making small ticking noises. All of them aimed toward me, not the sun, not the wind, me. That was the moment. I knew this wasn't about a haunting or a curse. It was a message. The cemetery was thinking, processing, reaching out, trying to touch me, to read me, maybe to write me. Back into itself, I sprinted toward the chapel, which mercifully hadn't moved. Its thick wooden doors stood just as they always had. But when I stepped inside, I stopped cold. The pews were gone. The altar was gone. Instead, the entire space had been cleared out. In the center of the floor sat a single object, my grandfather's hat, the same one that had hung in the hallway of the caretaker's house since the day I arrived. But it wasn't just the hat. It sat atop a mound of dirt that hadn't been there before circular, packed tight with another one of those brass plaques embedded in it. I knelt down, hands shaking, and read the inscription. Last witness. Listen long. The moment I touched it, the whispers returned, louder now, layered. I couldn't tell if they were angry or scared, maybe both, but the message was clear. Had been brought here, not hired, not offered an opportunity. Pulled, groomed, chosen. The lanterns along the chapel walls began to flicker. Even though they hadn't been lit, I backed away, heart in my throat, and stepped outside just as the chapel's bell began to toll. No one pulled the rope. The sound came from somewhere deeper. It rang once, twice, and on the third chime, as the roots across the cemetery lifted just a little higher, and the stones beneath them began to tilt inward, turning their faces not to the sky, but toward the center of the spiral, toward me. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't go home. I sat in the chapel until dawn, watching the soil outside shift like waves. The cemetery was changing again, and I was no longer an observer. I was part of it now, a chapter, being written in real time. By the third day without sleep, the body stops pretending everything is okay. My hands shook constantly, my eyes ached, and my thoughts flickered like moths hitting a bulb. I'd started to talk to myself without realizing. Simple things at first turn here. Don't trip, but by that night I was asking the stones questions, begging them for answers. And some part of me, expected them to answer, because they had been. Not out loud, not with full voices, but with changes, with signs. The spiral, the trench, the inscriptions, all of it was communication. I was starting to read it like a language. The placement of certain stones, the sudden vanishing of others, it formed a syntax. I could feel it. This wasn't just some shifting patch of haunted land. It was an organism. A memory that folded in on itself, pressing images and events into whoever stood in the center long enough. I began finding new graves each time I blinked. Not walked away and came back. Just blinked, one moment there'd be flat grass, the next a headstone. No digging, no sound. Just there, and each time I got closer, the names hit harder. These weren't historical figures or long-dead locals. They were names from my life, people I knew. An old classmate from middle school, Timothy Weller. My freshman year roommate from college, Cassie, Joe. My mother's best friend, Dana Sims. Each stone came with their full name, their date of birth, and their death date, which was always tomorrow, July 14th. I called Dana. No answer, I messaged Cassie. The message never showed as delivered. I looked up Timothy on social media. His page was still active, but someone had left a comment that just said, "Rest easy, Tim. Wish I'd called sooner." When the real weight of it hit me. Laurel Rest wasn't just remembering the dead, it was predicting them. Or maybe, worse, it was making decisions. I tried to tell someone. I really did. I sent emails to local journalists. I left a message with a paranormal investigator in Roanoke. I even called a priest. None of them responded. One woman did answer barely. She was the receptionist at the church where my grandfather had supposedly been baptized. When I asked about him, she just said, "Oh, you're his granddaughter," and hung up. Her voice had cracked like she wanted to say more but couldn't, or wasn't allowed to. That night, I went to the heart of the spiral again. My headstone had changed before. It had been blank beneath my birth date. But now, there was a carved timestamp. Death, 3:09 a.m. That was 3 hours from the moment I read it. I stumbled back, heart thudding, lungs burning, legs already cold. My first instinct was to run, pack a bag, jump in the car, flee as far as I could, and never look back. But I couldn't even find the house anymore. Laurel Rest had folded in around me. The pathways were gone, the gates moved. The only thing that remained constant was the spiral and its ever-thickening ring of names. I dropped to my knees, and for the first time, I didn't feel alone. I felt watched, but not by something cruel, not angry, just ancient. Like the ground was breathing slow and steady. waiting for me to understand something I hadn't yet pieced together. Then, from the chapel, I heard a sound I hadn't heard in days. Footsteps, not mine, someone else's. I ran toward it, practically tripping. Over headstones. The chapel was dark, but the door stood open. Inside, lit by a single lantern that hadn't held oil in years, stood a man I didn't recognize. Late 50s, gaunt, dressed in work clothes that looked 100 years old. He didn't speak. He just pointed to the back wall, where my grandfather's tapes had once sat in a neat row. In their place was a single book, leather-bound, thick, with my name embossed in gold on the spine. I walked forward slowly and opened it. The pages were blank. All of them except the first. It read, "The listener must finish the memory." The man stepped outside. I followed, but he was gone. No footsteps, no sound, just vanished. I turned back toward the graveyard, and every headstone glowed faintly, their letters shimmering like ink in candlelight. And then somewhere beneath me, the trench pulsed again, a heartbeat. Not mine, not human. The ground was alive, and it wanted to story mine. I had 3 hours left, and no idea how to stop what had already been written. At 2:45 a.m., I stood in the center of Laurel Rest, soaked with sweat, holding the leather-bound book that now bore my name. I'd spent hours trying to read meaning into its blank pages. To make sense of the instructions that haunted the front leaf, the listener must finish the memory. But there were no answers left in the stones. They'd gone still, not quiet still, like a stage set before a final act. The whispering had stopped. The trench no longer pulsed. The spiral was complete. I made my decision. I walked toward the southern edge of the cemetery, where a gate had once stood. Nothing looked familiar anymore. But I remembered the shape of the land, the subtle dip in the terrain, the way the trees curved toward the road. I pushed through overgrown brush and ducked under clawing branches, until finally, I saw asphalt. I ran harder than I had in my entire life, and when I reached the road, I collapsed on my knees and cried. The silence beyond the cemetery's boundary was deafening. No whispers, no breathing ground, no names changing under my feet. Just empty rural highway and the distant chirp of crickets. I checked my phone 3:11 a.m. I was 2 minutes past the time my grave had predicted. I was alive for now. When I got back to town, I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I sat in the motel room I'd booked under a fake name and stared at the book, waiting for the pages to fill themselves. Nothing. Just the same single line. I threw it against the wall, burned it in the motel fireplace, or at least I thought I did. The next morning, it was back in my bag. No scorch marks, no smell of smoke. I left town that same day, drove until the gas ran out, filled up, and kept. Going, I told myself I was done. The Laurel Rest would rot and collapse without me, that I had broken the chain my grandfather couldn't, that the spiral only reached those foolish enough to listen. But looking back, though, I think I knew even then that I hadn't escaped, because I still dream about the graves, and worse, other people do too. 2 months ago, met a woman at a roadside diner in West Virginia. We got to talking about nothing coffee, the weather, dead-end towns. But then she looked at me and asked, "Do you ever hear the names before they're written down?" I nearly dropped my fork. I said no, of course. I said I didn't know what she meant, but she only smiled. Sad, tired kind of smile. Then she pulled something from her purse and slid it across the table. It was a leather-bound book, black cover. No title, but this one had her name on the spine. She told me she'd inherited a cemetery too, not Laurel Rest, but something older. A place called Blackwater Cross. She said her mother used to say the same phrase over and over near the end. The ones who remember never die. They just forget how to leave. I left the diner without finishing my food. A week later, got a letter in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a photograph, grainy. It's black and white, of Laurel Rest. And in the corner of the frame, almost too small to see, was a stone, my stone. And someone was standing beside it. Not me, but someone wearing my grandfather. The same one. I'd buried in a box on my last day there? No message. No explanation, just that single image. The cemetery isn't finished with me, and worse. I don't think it's just the cemetery anymore. I think the spiral is spreading, one listener at a time. I should have known better than to say yes. When my Uncle Rick passed, I wasn't exactly close with him, but he'd been the last real link to my dad's side of the family. Quiet, solitary, never married. He'd lived his whole life in Ash Hollow, working as a cemetery groundskeeper, just like his father and grandfather before him. Everyone said the same things about him after the funeral. Good with his hands, kept to himself, knew every name in that graveyard by heart. But when the lawyer called and said I'd inherited his house, his tools, and the job, I should have said no. I had a life in Chicago. I was managing a hardware store, barely scraping by, but I had friends, an apartment, noise. I didn't. Need a yard full of tombstones and a legacy I never asked for. But I was broke and tired and more than a little curious. Ash Hollow is the kind of place that seems made from silence. A one-road town, a diner with no menu, and a cemetery that takes up more land than the actual neighborhoods. It's called Ash Hollow Rest, and it sits right on the edge of the forest, hundreds of years old, maybe more. The older plots are just mounds now, no stones left. The newer ones sit in neat rows, boxed in by brittle iron fencing and a tool shed that looks like it's been there since the Dust Bowl. My uncle's house is 100 yards from the Gates Mall with a sloped roof, wood that creaks when you breathe too hard, and one of those lamps that flickers for no reason even when the wiring's fine. I moved in the second week of October. Right when the air started going sharp, there was already frost clinging to the trees in the mornings, and most nights were dead quiet by 8. I started going through Rick's things slowly. He didn't own much. Some old clothes, worn boots, canned food in bulk. But in the back of the hallway closet, wrapped in an oilcloth and tied with rough twine, I found a binder. Not just any binder. This thing was fat, with AS tained, stuffed with handwritten notes, sketches, even Polaroids. It was labeled Depth. Logs Ash Hollow. Every page was a record. Name, date, cause of death. And most importantly, how deep the grave was dug. Almost all of them were between 5 and 7 feet. But on some, 7FT was circled in red ink, sometimes with small annotations beside it. Do not go deeper. Sealed layer encountered, soil resistance high, no further, and then one entry caught my eye. The name had been scratched out with ink so thick it bled through the page. All that remained was the depth, 8.5 feet. The note next to it just said, never again. The signs were all there. I just didn't listen. I should have burned that binder the moment I read that line. But instead, I kept flipping pages, and that curiosity inched its way into something worse need. I needed to know why. What was at 8.5 feet? What was buried that had to be hidden? 2 days later, the town manager stopped by. His name was Lolelthan, gray-haired, with a kind of handshake that leaves your knuckles aching. He handed me a folder with the week's scheduled burials and gave a brief rundown of the process. No machinery allowed. All graves dug by hand. Records submitted to the township weekly. Pretty normal, till the last page. It was titled Ash Hollow Rules in big bold type rule. Hash 1. Never dig deeper than 7 feet. Rule number 2. If you strike stone, stop. Rule number 3. If you hear anything below, cover immediately and report to Lowell. I remember laughing, thinking it was some local superstition, a leftover relic from when people feared plague pits and bad luck. But Lowell didn't laugh. With me, he just looked at me really, looked and said, "They're not jokes, son. Your uncle kept that line for 30 years. I expect you'll do the same." That night, I couldn't sleep. The binder sat on the table beside me like it was humming. I kept thinking about that 8.5-foot entry, about how the name had been blacked, out like it didn't deserve to be remembered. I stared at the page until the numbers started to blur. I finally crashed just after 3 a.m., but I dreamt of roots-long brittle things curling around my ankles and pulling me downward. I woke with dirt under my fingernails. I hadn't left the bed. I'll skip the boring stuff learning how to file. Reports, clearing leaves, resetting crooked headstones. The physical work didn't bother me. In some weird way it helped, gave my mind something to focus on besides the binder. But even during the day, the air around Ash Hollow felt strange still. There were no birds, no squirrels darting between the trees. The wind barely moved the grass. Everything just sat, waiting. By the third week, I started checking out the older sections, the parts of the cemetery that hadn't seen new burials in decades. The soil back there felt wrong. Every time I stepped into that section, the ground seemed to sink a little. Not like mud. More like the land was tired of being stepped on. And the markers. Most were unreadable. Time had erased names and dates, but not their placements. Someone had etched small red numbers on the backs of some stones, old faded. I found 119 scratched faintly into one, then 120 on the next. They weren't plot numbers. I checked the registry; those graves weren't in the records. At all then, as I raked near an old willow tree, I tripped over something solid, buried just beneath the grass. It wasn't a stone, it was a lid. I cleared away more dirt and found what looked like a wooden hatch, nailed shut, sealed with what I thought was tar boot had the feel of dried blood. There were no markings, no handles, no hinges. It's just a lid in the dirt that shouldn't have been there. That night, I combed through the binder again and found a set of Polaroids. Tucked into a back pocket, several blurry shots of the older section, and one unmistakable picture of the hatch I had just uncovered. On the back of it, written in my uncle's handwriting, were 3 words: "Don't let it breathe." That phrase dug into me. Not "don't open it," not "don't touch it," but "don't let it breathe." Like it was a warning about something alive beneath there. Something sealed tight that might exhale if given the chance. I couldn't sleep again. The wind outside howled all night, even though the trees never moved. Below, like something was shifting under the roots of the cemetery. Stirring in the dark, I started marking the spots where the soil felt. Strangest where the shovel hit air pockets too early, or where worms never showed up. These weren't graves, not normal ones. They were ... hollow. Wrong, like space had been. Carved into the ground, and then filled with nothing. I kept track in a fresh notebook, adding red X's to the map. I recreated from the binder, and the X's kept forming a shape. Not a spiral like the last story I told you. No, this one was jagged. Like a jaw. A semicircle of teeth. I plot my uncle's old grave digging. Zone sat directly behind the curve of it. The mouth, if I had to name it, faced a low stone hill near the edge of the grounds. Capped with a single headstone dated 1842. No name. No epitaph. Just the symbol of a circle with 7 vertical lines slashed through it. That same symbol had appeared in the binder beside 3 other entries, all graves marked as sealed. I didn't tell Lowell, I didn't know how, and honestly, I didn't trust him. He'd been acting ... Off. At first I thought it was just small town weirdness. But he started stopping by, unannounced. Asking questions he already knew the answers to. You see anything? Buried deeper than it should be? You hear anything out by the willows? Always smiling, but the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. One afternoon, I found him standing behind the shed, staring at the forest line. When I called out, he didn't flinch, didn't blink, just turned and walked away like nothing had happened. And that's when I found the second binder. It wasn't in the house. It was buried in the shed, hidden under the floorboards beneath the old workbench. This one was smaller, but older worn. Nearly smooth by time, inside the writing was messier, panicked. Several pages had bloodstains, and one section, near the middle, was written in a different hand, entirely scrawled in pencil like the writer had run out of ink and time. The entry was brief, but it stayed with me. It feeds through roots. The earth is only skin. Do not let it wake. Never break the stone seal. The next day, I was scheduled to dig a new grave for a man named Matthew Collar. Nothing unusual. Plot 83B. Standard depth, 6.5 feet. But when I reached 5 feet, shovel struck something solid. It wasn't a coffin. It wasn't a rock. It was another lid, and it breathed, just once, like it was relieved to be found. The lid I hit, beneath plot 83B, hadn't been listed in the burial records. There was no mention of it in the plot diagrams, no note from Lowell, and nothing in either of the binders. It was unmarked, untouched for who knows how long. But the way the earth shifted, after I hit it, that soft exhale of trapped air, it made my stomach knot like I'd just stepped into a room I was never supposed to enter. The smell that came with it was hard to describe. Not rot, not gas. It was older, like damp cloth sealed in wood for generations, mixed with something sharp, and sour, like copper or blood. I didn't open it. I covered it up and walked away. I filled the grave shallow and marked it complete on the log. I told myself I'd figure it out later, but even as I patted the last shovelful of soil flat, I could still feel the air around me, shaking barely, like a string had been plucked beneath the surface. That night, I woke up to the floorboards creaking in the hallway. I thought maybe it was just the house settling, but when I got up and opened the door, the hallway light was already on. I never turned it on. I keep lights off when I sleep, always have. But there it was, flickering soft yellow, like someone had been walking through minutes before. I checked the front door. Locked. Back door. Also locked. The windows were shut, and there were no footprints in the dust across the floor. Then, saw the muddy marks on the ceiling. They weren't footprints. They were handprints. Faint, but unmistakable streaks of old earth dragged in five-fingered smears across the wood slats above my head. No one had been up there. There was no attic, just roof. Looking back, though, I should have known then. Should have. Left, packed a bag, and never returned. But curiosity's a tricky thing. It convinces you you're safe as long as you're the one watching. The next few days blurred. I tried focusing on the regular work, tidying, trimming, replacing worn flowers, submitting reports, but I kept thinking about the binder, the lid, the jaw-shaped pattern of graves. I started hearing sounds during the day now, low rumbling from the soil, not deep enough to be dismissed as wind. Twice I heard something that sounded like ... chewing. Slow. Steady. It stopped whenever I stepped too close. In the house more. Handprints appeared. This time on the windows, inside and out. Long, bony fingers, some dragging down the glass, like they were searching for a crack. I cleaned them. They came back. Always overnight. One morning I found the word closer, written on the mirror in the bathroom, drawn in soil. Not blood, not steam, dirt. Same clay black as the soil around plot. 83 byte. I started keeping the lights on all night. I slept with a flashlight in one hand and a hammer in the other. Every sound felt like it came with weight behind it. Pressure. The air grew heavier, especially in the back room where my uncle had kept his coats. I found myself avoiding that room altogether after I opened the closet one evening and found all the sleeves turned inside out, stiffed with dried mud. The final straw, though, was the dog. I didn't own one, never have, but I started hearing a dog scratching outside the front door around 3 a.m. every night. Just soft at first, then harder, then whining. The first time it happened, I peeked through the curtains, expecting maybe a stray. What I saw instead was a shape that looked like a dog, about the right height, right posture, but its legs were too long. And it didn't move right. It stood too still. Head tilted up, but no eyes reflected the porch light. Just a blank wet face. Then it stood on two legs and walked into the woods. I didn't sleep again for 2 days. On the third morning, I returned to the site where I'd found the sealed lid. The grave I'd filled was sunken, more than it should have been. A good 3 inches lower, like the dirt had been pulled from below. I dug fast, frantic, until I reached the surface of the lid again, but it wasn't sealed anymore. The tar, blood, or whatever it had been, was cracked. The edges curled back, brittle and dry, like it had been eaten through, and there were scratch marks on the underside of the lid. Not from above, from inside. Thin claw lines that raked outward, Something had been pushing up, trying to get out, and finally ... did. I didn't report it. What would I even say? Instead, I began marking every tree around the property with red chalk. I don't know why. Maybe I thought it would help. Maybe I was hoping if something came again, it'd stop at the line. But the next morning, all the chalk was gone, not just faded, washed clean. And carved into the trunk of the tallest pine was a single word, gouged deep: feed. I should have known better. I told myself I was just doing research, just digging into old family history for peace of mind. But that was a lie. I wasn't looking for paisai, I was looking for a reason to stay, to justify the pressure in my chest that said, don't leave yet. The truth is, I'd already crossed a line, and somewhere inside, I think I wanted to know what it would cost me. I started with the town's historical records. Ash Hollow keeps them in a cramped little library. That doubles as the post office. The woman behind the counter, Mrs. Acker, eyed me with that same look I'd gotten from Lowell. Not fear exactly, more like recognition, like she'd seen my face before in another time on someone else. When I told her my last name, she nodded and disappeared into the back without a word. She returned with a faded file folder tied with red string and set it down with a flat, almost guilty expression. It's not all in there, she said, but it's enough to ruin your appetite. Inside were newspaper clippings, death records, cemetery plot charts, some so old they looked ready to crumble. One article stood out, dated May 1894. Headline: Gravedigger collapses during burial and covers mass grave below cemetery. The story was short. A man named Elias Grunther, age 38, had been preparing a new plot when his shovel punched through into an air pocket. He fell 6 feet into what was described as a subterranean bone chamber. No images, just one chilling quote from Elias before he died of infection a week later. The bones weren't buried, they were waiting. Below that, someone had underlined the line in red and scribbled, "Family tie, Grunther equals mom's side. Check tree." I nearly dropped the page. My mother's maiden name was Grunther. I had no idea we were tied to Ash Hollow before my uncle. But sure enough, when I dug out the half-finished family tree in one of Rick's binders, Elias was right. They're my great-great-grandmother's brother. It didn't stop there. 3 more entries appeared across the decades, all tied to people with my blood. A boy named Henry, 1912. Age 9, died from soil sickness after being found sleepwalking near the graveyard at night. A woman named Alma, 1936, my great-aunt who went missing and was never found, last seen placing flowers on her father's grave. And then, 1978, my grandfather's brother, David, who had supposedly drowned. But the police report said no water was found in his lungs. His body had been exhumed. His tongue was missing. All of them were buried in Ash Hollow. All of them on or near sealed plots, marked with that same strange symbol, a circle with 7 vertical slashes. That night, I returned to the back room in Rick's house, the one I'd been avoiding. The air was heavy, the smell earthy and wrong. I pulled everything from the closet and knocked out the drywall behind it. Half out of desperation, half following an instinct I didn't understand, behind it was a space no wider than a man's shoulders, brick-lined, and at the far end, a box, wooden, bolted shut, wrapped in cloth covered in salt rings. I opened it with a crowbar. Inside were journals, 3 of them, all written by my grandfather, and every page was worse than the last. He'd known, all of them had. Going back 5 generations. Ash Hollow wasn't just a cemetery, it was a containment field, a cover-up, a ritual. Something had been buried here before the town ever had a name. They didn't call it a demon or a ghost. They called it the feeder. And every few decades it stirred. When people dug too deep, or the soil got dry, or someone ignored the 7-foot rule, then the hunger returned. They fed it carefully, never people, not at first. Livestock, once, bones. Soil rich with blood. They called it tending the mouth. My grandfather had written that the ground needed to stay satisfied, or else it started pulling on its own. Sometimes it took people, sometimes it didn't. Leave bodies, I read until sunrise. My hands were shaking. I barely noticed that the walls around me had started to sweat. Literal moisture dripping down the paneling, as if the house itself was reacting. When I stumbled outside for air, I noticed something else. Every grave along the western fence line had changed. The soil had turned black oily, almost like wet ink. The grass had receded completely. In the middle of each patch, a single line had been carved into the dirt by something with long fingers. 7 of them, I counted. 7 shallow trenches, leading straight toward my house. By the end of that week, I stopped pretending anything was normal. I stopped checking the weather, stopped logging the graves I cleaned, and barely remembered to eat. All I could think about were the journals and that phrase repeating over and over in my grandfather's trembling hand. It feeds through roots. The earth is only skin. The ground around the cemetery was starting to look sick. The older graves pulsed with moisture like they were sweating. Worms crawled across the surface in clusters. And every morning, another grave sat freshly disturbed, but none were scheduled for reburial, and no one was buried there. They were being dug out. I tried to tell Lowell, and I drove straight to his office and demanded to know what the hell was going on. He didn't even blink. He just handed me a folder and said, "You have 2 more burials to prep this week. Don't go deeper than 7. That was it. His voice didn't carry worry or urgency, or even frustration. Just cold expectation. Like he'd been waiting for this to happen, right? And now it was my turn to carry the weight. I pressed him. "Did you know about the feeder? The symbol? The journals?" And he just leaned back in his chair, gave me this tired look, and said, "We all pay it down, son. Your uncle did his part. Now it's your season." Season. That word rang in my head for hours afterward. Like I wasn't a man anymore. I was just a crop. Something raised to be harvested. When I got back to the house, the lights were all on ones I hadn't used in weeks. Inside, the smell had changed. It wasn't just dirt anymore. It was sweet, sticky like decayed fruit or meat gone soft and wet. I followed it to the kitchen, where I found a small pile of soil on the counter. Right in the center sat a tooth. Not human. It's too long, curved like a hook. I cleaned the counter, threw the tooth in the trash, locked every door and window, and tried to convince myself I was still in control. I wasn't. That night, the walls thudded dead, not creaked, not groaned. Thudded like fists from the inside. I sat on the floor of the hallway with my back to the wall, flashlight shaking in my hands. It happened again. 1.2.3 hits. Then silence. Then a knock right behind my head. The wood flexed beneath me. I could feel it, like something in the wall inhaling slowly. I scrambled into the living room only to find every picture. Frame on the floor glass cracked, some faces scratched out completely. I didn't fall asleep. I passed out from fear sometime after 4 a.m., waking to find dirt scattered across the floor, around my bed like something had paced in a circle while I slept. I started burning things the next day. The journals, the binders, even the photo of my grandfather that had always hung in the front hallway. Fire barely caught. Everything was damp, like the pages had sucked in the moisture from the very walls. But eventually, the flames rose. For a moment, the air lightened. But then I heard something move under the house, crawling, slow, and the flames turned green. I ran outside, didn't look back. I just ran straight into town and banged on Mrs. Acker's door until my knuckles bled. She opened it wearing a robe, holding a shotgun. But when she saw my face, my real face, she let me in. I told her everything. I expected disbelief, laughter, pity, but she just listened. Poured me coffee and said it's not the first time. It's woken up. She told me there were families, old ones, tied to Ash Hollow bloodlines, tasked with keeping the feeder buried. Every few decades, someone failed. Sometimes they tried to ignore it. Sometimes they ran. Sometimes they dug too deep. But it always came back. The earth doesn't forget, she said. It just waits to be fed. She gave me one thing before I left: a small carved stone. Black, cold to the touch, with the same 7-line symbol etched into it. Keep this. On your chest when you sleep, she said. It might not stop it, but it'll know you know. That matters. I wore it that night and dreamed of my mother. She was sitting in a chair, holding a trowel in her lap, covered in mud. She looked too young. Her eyes were glassy. She said one thing before the dream ended. Don't let it in. Not again. Woke up choking on soil, a mouthful of it. No idea how it got there. The walls thudded again, only this time I wasn't sure if the sound came from inside, ... or beneath. I spent most of the next day digging out graves, not official plots, just holes. Shallow ones, deep ones, randomly spaced around the older section of the cemetery where the activity had been strongest. I wasn't looking for bodies. I was looking for answers. For bones. For seals. For anything that might make the journal. Entries and nightmares feel less like warnings and more like puzzles I could still solve. I found bones, all right to many. Some human, some not, some still warm, even though the earth around them was cold as winter. And under one, buried beneath layers of black root and soft clay, I found a second stone like the one Mrs. Acker had given me. This one had cracks, like it had tried to hold something in and failed. I brought it home and set it beside the first. The moment I did, the lights in the house flickered and cut out. All of them, at once. The floor trembled. Not like an earthquake, this wasn't natural. It was a pulse, like the earth breathing in. And in that breath I heard voices. Not loud. Not words, but voices. They came through the floor, not the air. I could feel them in my bones more than I could hear them. Like someone had turned my skeleton into a tuning fork for whispers. I lit candles, drew the symbol from the journal on every doorframe, salted the windows. I wasn't even sure what I believed in anymore, but I knew whatever had been sealed wasn't just a myth. It was something real and hungry. That night, I read through my grandfather's last entries pages I had skipped before because they'd been written in frantic, almost illegible scrawl. One page had only 5 words repeated over and over until the ink bled through. It knew my name. That's when it hit me. Maybe it wasn't just the earth that needed feeding. Maybe the thing buried beneath us had learned to reach through memory, through blood, through lineage. And maybe, just maybe, that's why my uncle had never had kids. Why my mother had cut ties with her brother and never spoken of Ash Hollow. Why I was left this place only after every other line of our family tree had rotted away. I wasn't chosen to inherit it. I was the last offering, so I made a plan. I returned to the cracked stone behind plot 83B, carried it to the heart of the cemetery. I marked 7 graves in a circle and placed the stone at the center, exactly as described in one of the ritual pages in Rick's journals. Then I poured salt and blood into the earth, my own blood, spoke the names of my ancestors aloud, and for each one, the wind picked up. Leaves spiraled inward. The ground turned soft under my knees. I was doing something, stirring it in a different way, and that's when I heard the laughter. Not human, not childlike. Something between. It came from beneath the nearest grave one, marked TL 1863, a plot I'd never touched, never looked twice at. The soil cracked, opened in a slow circle, and from it rose a tongue. Yes, a tongue. Long, dry, coated in grit. It didn't wag, it didn't move, simply rose, like a signal, and hung in the air, dripping soil as if tasting the world above for the first time in decades. Then it vanished, sucked back into the earth like it had never been there. My ritual hadn't sealed anything. It had summoned attention, back at the house. I found the mirror cracked. My name was written on the bathroom wall in dried mud, traced. Over and over again. Nathan, Nathan, Nathan. Always in the same scrawl as my grandfather's journals, but it wasn't his handwriting. It was mine. I never wrote it, unless I did. Unless something used my hands while I slept. The worst part. My voice had started to change. Low at first, only in the mornings, like I was losing it from overuse. But it didn't come back. It stayed ragged, whispery. As though I'd been speaking through soil for years, and only now remembered how to breathe air. I tried to run one night, packed a bag, got in the car, turned the ignition, and nothing. dead battery, then the headlights. Blinked on by themselves, the radio crackled. Every station, same whisper, "You belong to the mouth." I screamed, ran back into the house. Slammed the door, the floor shook, the walls bled soil, and in the middle of the living room, drawn with roots and mud, was that symbol against even lines through a circle. But this time, it was upside down. I don't know what that means, but I know. I'm running out of time. I don't remember the last day I slept. Not really. I lie down sometimes, but I don't dream anymore. Not like normal people. I just see dirt, layer after layer. Bones shifting under roots, eyes inside, skulls that blink. The first time I blacked out, I woke up covered in soil, fingers, blistered, shovel lying beside me. There was a hole in the yard, perfectly round, 6 feet deep. The grass hadn't been dug, it had been peeled. Like skin, I didn't remember digging, but the hole was mine. That was weeks ago. Since then, there have been more holes, 7 to be exact. They don't stay empty. Every time I black out now, I wake to find one filled in. No body, no name, just freshly packed earth and the faint smell of wet breath fifth that makes any sense. And each morning after, my voice is a little quieter, my hands a little colder. I can't taste food anymore. Water makes me gag. I sleep with dirt under my nails, no matter how many times I scrub them raw. Looking back though, the moment that sealed, it wasn't the first dream, or the cracked seal, or even the tongue rising from the grave. It was the day. I found the photograph. Came in the mail. No note. No return address. Just an old Polaroid of me. Or someone who looked like me, wearing my coat, standing by a grave. Smiling with black eyes. The back read, "You're doing great. One more to go." I burned it. Or tried. It turned to ash, then reformed in the sink, folded neatly. Same. Handwriting. I've stopped trying to leave. I drove out to the town border last Thursday and found the roads washed out. Maps won't load anymore. That GPS sends me in circles. Every house I pass is either empty or pretending to be. Mailboxes filled with old flyers. Newspapers from 5 years ago. I saw someone watching me once, from behind a curtain butt when I blinked. They were gone, and the window was bricked over. The last time I saw Mrs. Acker, she was walking barefoot through the cemetery with a lantern. I called her name. She didn't turn, didn't even blink, just walked until she reached the hill above the old family plots, then melted into the fog. She was never really there. Maybe she wasn't. Maybe none of them are. I keep finding books in the house that weren't there before. Ledgers. Lists of names I don't recognize. But they're all written in my handwriting. One by one, each marked with a symbol beside it. 7 lines in a circle. Some crossed out, some smudged like they've been handled too much. And one, the last name on the newest page, is my own. Underlined twice, the hole behind the house is deeper now. Not wider dash deeper. It goes beyond the 6 feet standard. I dropped a flashlight in last night to test how far it goes. I never heard. It hit the bottom. Only the sound of breath rising back up. Slow, hungry, patient. This morning, I heard something worse. My name not. Shouted. Whispered from inside the ground. Over and over again. And it wasn't asking for help. It was calling me home. I tried to resist. I really did. I dug out every symbol, erased every mark, smashed the stones, burned the old ledgers, but they came back. In the walls. In my skin. I found a fresh symbol scabbed into my arm 2 days ago. The wound won't close. It weeps dark soil, not blood. I don't think I'm alive the way most people are anymore. I don't think I'm dead either. I think I'm becoming a feeder, a memory in the soil, a thing that watches through the eyes of the dead. There's only one grave left to dig, and I know exactly where it is. I saw it last night in a dream that didn't feel like a dream. The ground opened, the stars blinked out. My family stood in a circle around my uncle, my grandfather Elias, even Alma, whose body was never found. They were smiling, they were whispering the same thing. It's your season. I understand. Now the earth doesn't want to bury me. It wants me to stay, to wait, to feed. I should have walked away the moment I saw the ad. It was one of those grainy, grayscale listings in the back of the local paperite, under lost cats and estate liquidations. Just read, cemetery assistant needed discretion. Required midnight shifts. No experience necessary. I was broke. Behind on rent. My car had just been repossessed. And the only other job offer on the table involved handing out flyers in a giant lobster costume outside a seafood buffet. So, yeah, I applied. The place was called St. Cavan's Rest, a hilltop cemetery just outside a fog-blanketed coastal town called Dunharrow. I hadn't even heard of it until that week, but when I Googled it, there was barely anything just. One review on an old travel site that said unremarkable but eerie. I figured I'd be mowing lawns, maybe dealing with some raccoons. Nothing I couldn't handle. The phone interview lasted 3 minutes. They asked if I had a clean record, if I could keep a secret, and if I had a strong stomach. I said yes. They told me to report Monday at 11:45 p.m. It wasn't until I was driving up the cracked coastal road, fog so thick I could barely see the hood of my borrowed car, that it started to feel wrong. Not bad, just off. Like the kind of wrong you don't notice until it's already behind your eyes. The cemetery gate was heavy iron, creaked like a scream when it opened. A man stood waiting just inside with an oil lantern on, a flashlight. He didn't introduce himself, didn't shake my hand. Just said, "You're early. That's good. Midnight doesn't like waiting." I followed him down a gravel path that looped between rows of mossy headstones, most so worn down I couldn't read the names. There were 6 larger plots set in 2. A separate quadrant surrounded by a low stone wall, no higher than my knees. These ones had no names, just numbers. I, 2, 3, 4, V, Vi. I remember asking, why no names? But the man didn't answer. He handed me a small brass key and said, "You'll need this for the record shed. Don't open anything else." Then he was gone. Literally gone. I turned around for 1 second to look at the plots again. And when I turned back, the man had vanished. No footsteps, no parting words. It's just empty gravel and fog, so thick it looked like smoke. I should have left, but the money wasn't worth it for nothing, right? They were paying cash generously, and I needed it badly. The shed was old and smelled, like damp cedar. Inside was a ledger, a lantern, a wooden chair, and a radio with a cracked speaker. I checked the first few pages of the ledger. Each night was logged by hand with neat angular writing. Always the same entries. Midnight. Gate check. 12:30. Plot inspection. 1 o'clock. Station watch. 1:45. Secondary patrol. 2:15. Confirm graves. 3 o'clock. Log any disturbance. Simple enough. Did the first patrol without incident. The place was dead. Quiet literally. No animals, no wind. Just that weird muffled hush you only get in fog so thick it swallows the sound. When I passed by the numbered graves, I swear I heard something, a faint ticking. Not from my watch, not from the shed. From beneath the ground, that's when I noticed the watch. It was lying beside grave IV. An old, silver pocket watch. Not buried, not weathered, just placed there as if someone had set it down a minute ago. I picked it up. It ticked once, then stopped. No inscription, no initials. Just a stillness that made my spine ache. I put it in my jacket and finished the shift. At 3 a.m. sharp, logged no disturbance, locked the shed, and left. I told myself I'd just been jumpy, that it was my imagination, new job nerves. Nothing more. But when I got home, the watch was gone. I swear I had it in my coat pocket. But when I checked again, nothing. And when I opened my apartment door, something was lying on my kitchen table. The pocket watch, still ticking. But now it was set to 12:01. I showed up the next night even earlier. Mostly because I couldn't sleep, and partly because I wanted to see if the watch would be waiting for me again. It wasn't. It had disappeared from the kitchen table as mysteriously as it arrived. The only thing that remained was a faint, circular Stain on the wood where it had rested like time itself had burned a mark there. I checked my coat twice. Empty. I brought nothing with me but a thermos of coffee and a flashlight I didn't trust. The fog was thicker than before, and the air smelled like salt and rust familiar, but wrong, like brackish water that hadn't moved in centuries. I was unlocking the shed when I heard someone cough behind me. I nearly dropped the key. A man was standing near the gate, tall, bald, wearing a windbreaker zipped up to his neck. He raised a hand casually. New blood. He said, like a greeting and a warning all at once. His name was Griggs. He said he worked the alternate shift, whatever that meant. He'd been with the cemetery almost 15 years. Said he started part-time after a stint in the Navy, then just never left. I asked him about the graves, the 6 numbered ones, but he just squinted at me and said, "Don't stare too long at them. You'll start hearing things you can't forget." That was the first of many cryptic answers I'd get. Griggs walked me through some of the lesser-known routines that weren't written in the ledger, like never leaving the lantern too close to the graves, always doing your last patrol counterclockwise, never responding to voices, even if they sound like someone you know. I laughed when he said that. Tia. Then he told me about the watch. He said it's been passed around for decades. Appears when the shift is starting to change you. It marks you, he said. Lets the thing beneath know who's next. I tried to ask what the thing was, but Griggs just shook his head. We don't name it, not anymore. Make it listen. Listening makes it follow. At this point, I started wondering if the job had driven the guy a little stir-crazy. He had this haunted look like he hadn't slept in weeks. His hands were covered in what looked like old scars, or burns, and he rubbed them constantly when he talked. But part of me, the part that had seen the watch move on its own, that had smelled the decay under the fog, wasn't so quick to write him off. The rest of the night was uneventful, or at least nothing moved. But the quiet was wrong. It wasn't. Peaceful, it was expectant, like something was watching us from behind the gravestones, holding its breath. At 2:15, I did the secondary patrol alone. Griggs said he had to check the cellar. I didn't know the cemetery even had a cellar, but I wasn't about to question it. That's when I noticed one of the numbered graves, grave 3, looked ... different. The dirt was drier than the others, smoother, like someone had raked it recently. There were no tools left behind, no signs of animals, no footprints. Just that same strange ticking sound, faint and steady, coming from somewhere beneath. I knelt to listen closer, flashlight off. Ears straining, then I heard my name. Not whispered. Not shouted, spoken, clear as day. Eli. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was too close, too calm, like someone was just behind my ear. I spun around, light sweeping wildly across the stones. Nothing. I nearly tripped running back to the shed. Griggs was waiting inside, silent, just staring at the radio on the shelf. It was playing static. "Did you hear that?" I asked out of breath. He nodded. "That grave," I started to say, but he cut me off. "They talk when they want to be fed." He didn't say anything else. That was the end of the conversation. I signed the log at 3 o'clock. It's always marking no disturbance because I didn't know what else to write. What was I going to put? Grave talked to me, ticked like a bomb, also maybe got cursed by a ghost watch at night. I found a second stain on my kitchen table, bigger this time, and a note taped to the mirror. Not my handwriting, just 3 words, 5 to go. I didn't sleep the next day. I closed all the blinds, shut off my phone, drank half a bottle of cough syrup, but every time I drifted, I saw the numbered graves. Not as they were, but open, yawning, like mouths. I kept seeing the dirt shift and settle like something breathing beneath it. And always the ticking. By dusk, I gave up on rest and started digging through the old ledger again, hoping for anything I'd missed. Something that would explain the voice, the watch, the message on my mirror. At first glance, the log entries were all standard until I noticed a page with a water stain that had smudged part of the ink. Scratched lightly in the margins, almost as an afterthought, was a note I hadn't seen before. It read, "Third shift, grave 3, 3:45. Don't let him finish the count." I didn't know what that meant, but it stuck with me. I showed up. Early again, just to get it over with. Fog still thick. Griggs wasn't there this time. The shed door was unlocked, though, and the ledger was turned to a fresh page, the ink not quite dry, except I hadn't written anything yet, and no one else was supposed to be on this shift. I checked the date, it matched, and next to the time. Slots someone had already written the entries. Every single one said the same thing, confirmed. All accounted for. 5 to go. That phrase was starting to dig into my skull. I flipped back through previous week's logs, checking for patterns. That's when I realized something I hadn't noticed before. Every few months, the entries stopped listing all 6 graves. Instead, they'd only list 5. ... then 4. Then 6 again, like it reset. It was subtle. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But once I saw the pattern, it chilled me to the core. Something happened when the count dropped. Something people weren't writing down. I left the shed, lantern in hand, and headed toward the numbered plots. The fog clung thick, and the wind had picked up just enough to whisper through the grass. It sounded like 100 voices mumbling just out of range. I passed grave 2, then 3, and stopped at 4. The dirt was smooth, clean, the kind of clean. That meant someone had been here with purpose. There was something sticking out of the ground at first. I thought it was a root. Then I saw it was a finger old, pale, gnarled just the tip, poking through like someone had tried to crawl up but changed their mind halfway. I bent closer, half horrified, half hypnotized, and then it twitched. I stumbled. Back dropped the lantern. It didn't go out, thank God, but it rolled a few feet away. When I looked up again, the finger was gone. The ground was undisturbed, like it had never happened, except now there was a new item at the foot of grave 4, a shoe mine covered in dirt and old blood. I ran back to the shed and locked the door behind me. I tried to radio for help, but all I got was static. Then a click, and that same voice as before flat. Call, just outside my left ear. 4. Just that, nothing more. And then the static returned. That's when it hit me. The numbers weren't just grave markers. They were steps. The countdown 654. And if I was holding the watch, the message was right. That meant I was already in the cycle. Already part of whatever ritual this job was masking. I wasn't here to protect the graves. I was here to replace one. I hadn't seen Griggs in over a week by then. No texts, no sightings, no shift overlaps. He wasn't just absent, he was avoided. The other workers, if they existed, never showed up when I was on duty. I started to think maybe Griggs was the last one, until the night he knocked on my car window as I was about to start my shift. He looked worse than before, gaunt, with deep lines around his eyes and fingers that wouldn't stop twitching against his coat. He didn't say hello, but he just slid into the passenger seat and locked the door. "You've seen it now," he muttered. I didn't answer. "You've heard the voice, found the watch, seen the dirt move. Don't lie. It knows when you lie." I wanted to ask 100 questions, but his tone made it clear there wasn't time. He stared out the windshield like he couldn't bring himself to look at me. "We don't bury strangers here," he said softly. "Each of those graves there for us. It's for the ones who take the job, take the money, and stay. One by one, we dig our own. You don't even know we're doing it. It starts with blackouts, then the sleepwalking, then the counting. And by the time the 6th grave is ready, the midnight man wakes up. Hungry." He finally looked at me. "The thing in the ground, it doesn't just want a body. It wants a role filled. Someone to carry the clock, to reset the cycle. It feeds on order. That's why the rules matter. That's why the logs are written like rituals. Think you're tracking time? No, you're feeding it structure, keeping its rhythm alive." My mouth was dry. I asked him what happened if someone quits. He laughed, a hoarse, ugly sound. "You don't quit, you just get added to the rotation. If you're lucky, you stay asleep when it uses you. If not, well then, you get to watch yourself dig." He reached into his jacket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. I unwrapped it carefully. It was a pocket watch, but not the one I'd found. This one had a crack running through the glass and a smear of something that It looked like rust or blood along the hinge. It was mine, he said. It's yours. Means I've got one more grave to dig, ... and then I'm done. I asked him what happened when all 6 were filled. He looked out the window again, then at Walks. I didn't want to believe him. I really didn't. But deep down, something told me he wasn't lying. The scars on his hands weren't from accidents. They were from digging nights he didn't remember, tools he didn't drop, voices he couldn't silence. Before he left, he handed me a folded piece of paper. Read it when you hear the 3rd tick, not before, and don't throw it away. Opened the door and disappeared into the fog, same as before. No farewell. Just gone. I didn't go inside the shed that night. I sat in the car, clutching the cracked watch, counting the seconds. When the 3rd tick came, I opened the note. It had only one line: don't let them all rise. Though it was a list of names, 6. In total, mine was the 6th. I read that note a dozen times. and I'm at the bottom of the list. It wasn't handwritten. It had been typed like a form someone had filled out long ago. The paper was old, brittle at the edges, like it had been carried for years. I didn't sleep that day either. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw dirt packed into my mouth, felt roots curling around my legs, heard the low mechanical tick-tick of the pocket watch, like it wasn't counting seconds anymore, but heartbeats. Mine. When I got to the cemetery that night, the gate was already open, not swung ajar fully open like it was expecting me. The fog had cleared a little, but that didn't make it easier to see. Everything looked too still, like the cemetery was holding its breath. Grave, I was disturbed. The ground had shifted. Fresh soil turned up. I didn't want to check, but I had to. That's the sick part of all this. You always want to check, even when you know you shouldn't. That's how it gets you. You look, you listen, count. The grave was empty, not dug up, opened, and near the edge was something even worse than a missing body, a shovel with my name carved into the handle. I never brought that shovel. I never carved it, but it was mine. I went to the shed, praying for the radio to work, to call someone, anyone. It buzzed with static, same as always. I flipped through the ledger, hoping for answers. Instead, I found something worse. A page tucked in the back labeled Transition Protocol. Under it were typed instructions in perfect alignment. Number smudges, no notes, just steps. When 5 are filled, initiate shift. Lantern must remain lit. Final grave must be dug by bearer. Do not assist, do not interrupt, do not observe. Repeat, do not observe. Below that, another warning, this one hand-scribbled. If he stops digging, you will have to take his place. My head spun. I remembered what Griggs had said, that he had one more grave to dig, then he was done, not freed, not released, just replaced. This whole job wasn't about guarding the cemetery. It was about sustaining the ritual. We weren't workers. We were parts, spare pieces to keep. The midnight man asleep, until the rhythm broke. I stepped outside the shed, lantern trembling in my hand, and saw movement near grave 2. Someone knows something was standing beside it, tall, too thin, face wrong. Just wrong, not in a gory way, in a geometrically off way. Like a person reassembled in the dark, limbs too long. Wide, but dressed in a caretaker's uniform mind. The thing looked up, it had my face, but the eyes were clocks, not eyes shaped like clocks. Actual, turning, ticking clock faces. It opened its mouth and said, 3 words, not whispered, not shouted, just spoken. Time is short, then it was gone. Not ran, not vanished, just ... Folded into the air like a page turned in a book. I backed away, fell to my knees near Grave Eye, and vomited into the grass. I don't remember getting up or walking back to the car, but when I came to, the watch was in my lap again. Only now, it was counting backward. 60 seconds, and ticking. I should have driven, should have gotten in the car and floored it all the way to another state. But I didn't. I sat there with the watch ticking in my lap, watching the seconds slide backward like they weren't counting down to a time but to an event. When it hit 0, I felt it. Not a bang, not a scream, just a pull. Like a thread in my chest had been yanked tight and was dragging me forward. I stood up like someone else was moving my legs. Walked to the graves, not to the shed, not to the road, just straight into the heart of the cemetery. All 6 were visible now. Even grave by my grave was starting to take shape. Not dug, not marked. Just the impression of a resting place. Like the earth was already missing me, and that's when I saw the others. 5 men, standing beside their graves, each wearing a caretaker uniform, each holding a lantern. Their faces were wrong, smeared like old paintings exposed to rain, but I could still make out something familiar in each one. One had Griggs's coat. Another had a scar I recognized from a photo in the ledger. These were the previous 6, the rotation, the ones before me. They weren't alive, but they weren't corpses either. They were held, frozen in time, forced to wait until the rhythm called them again, and then, from behind Grave Vi, someone rose. It was me, not a double, not a ghost. Me. Hair shorter, eyes darker, skin damp like it had just crawled from the soil. It had my breath, my movements, my thoughts, just one step ahead. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't respond. The ground under my heels softened, like the dirt was ready to take me in without a fight. That version of Mitha, one who digs, stepped forward with the shovel. I didn't scream. I couldn't. All I could do was watch as Hia began to dig the final grave. My arms moved, but I didn't tell them to. My hands gripped the shovel, but the decision wasn't mine. The rhythm had taken over, and every scoop of soil felt like a countdown carved into bone. The others watched silently, their lanterns flickering but never going out. Judging me, or maybe welcoming me. I wasn't sure which was worse. I kept digging until the dirt reached my knees, and then it stopped. I heard the watch tick once more, then silence. And in that silence, I felt something open under the soil knot. A coffin, not a chamber, a mouth. Something was awake. It didn't speak, it didn't crawl, it just waited. Waited for me to step in. I don't remember how I got out of the hole. One minute I was standing waist deep in soil that wasn't entirely earth, and the next I was lying flat on my back near the edge of the cemetery road, the shovel resting across my chest like a crucifix. My hands were raw. The watch was gone. And dawn was just beginning to bleed into the fog, turning everything silver and pale. The other 5 caretakers were gone too. No shadows, no footsteps, just 6 shallow depressions where the numbered graves had been. Grave Vitha, one I was digging, was now sealed. Perfectly level, grass already growing in like nothing had been disturbed. No tools, no wheelbarrow. No sign I'd spent hours digging except for the blistering ache in my muscles and the blood under my fingernails. And when I turned back to the shed, the door was locked, like it hadn't been opened in weeks. I didn't check the ledger. I didn't need to. I left, drove straight until I hit the state line. I never told anyone, not the police, not my family, not the next of kin contact for the cemetery. Didn't even quit. I just left the keys under the doormat and hoped that would be enough. I thought it was. But the thing is, you can leave the graveyard. The graveyard doesn't leave you. The first week after I ran, I started hearing the ticking again. Not just in my head, in the walls and the floorboards. Even the streetlights outside my apartment pulsed in time with it. Then came the dream's open mouths beneath my mattress, clock hands spinning inside my chest. Someone watching me from the mirror who didn't quite move when I did. 3 days ago, I got a package in the mail, no return address. Inside was the same pocket watch, still cracked, still ticking, and a note. Rotation resumes. 6 remain. That's when I realized I never stopped being the 6th. I changed locations. The final twist isn't that I escaped, it's that I brought it with me now. Some nights I walk in my sleep, always barefoot, always at 3 a.m., and each time, there's more dirt under my nails when I wake up. A little more gravel in the sheets. My closet smells like earth, the kind from one specific place. Last night, I opened my eyes and found I'd carved 6 numbers into the drywall beside my bed. This morning, only one remained. One, which means whether I want it or not. I'm digging again tonight, and if you've read this far, if you've followed my story, if you've heard the ticking start in your own ears while you read, you might want to check your floors. Sometimes. The grave doesn't wait for the body. Sometimes it comes looking.